Chapter 22 of The Silent Battle by George Gibbs. Recording by Tony Oliva. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Smoke and Fire. Downstairs, Miss Jaffray entered her machine and was driven northward. It is not for a moment to be supposed during the weeks which followed Mr. Egerton's party that Miss Jaffray had retired from the social scene, and if her rebuff at Phil Gallatin's hands had dampened the ardor of her enjoyment, no sign of it appeared. She was more joyously satirical, more unmitigably bored, more obtrusively indifferent than ever. But those who knew Nina best discovered a more daring unconvention in her opinions and a caustic manner of speech which spared no one, not even herself. She was, if anything, a concentrated essence of Nina Jaffray. A woman's potentiality for mischief proceeds in inverse ratio to her capacity for benevolence, and Nina's altruism was subjective. She gave her charity unaffectedly to all four-legged things except the fox, which had been contributed to the economic scheme by a beneficent providence for the especial uses of cross-country riders. She spent much care and sympathy upon her horses, and exacted its equivalent in muscular energy. Two-legged things enjoyed her liking in the exact proportion that they contributed to her amusement or in the measure that they did not interfere with her plans. But the word benevolent applied to Nina with about as much fitness as it would to the Tropic of Capricorn. The motto of New York is "The devil take the hindmost," and it feelingly voiced Nina's sentiments in the world and in the hunting field. She had always made it a practice to ride well up with the leaders and to keep clear of the underbrush, and had never had much sympathy for the laggards. There was a Spartan quality in her point of view with regard to others, which remained to be put to the test with regard to herself. The occasion for such a test, it seemed, had arrived. For the first time in her life she was apparently denied the thing she most wanted. She had even been willing to acknowledge to herself that she wouldn't have wanted Phil Gallatin if she hadn't discovered that he wanted someone else. But her liking for him had been transmuted into a warmer regard with a rapidity which really puzzled her and forced her to the conclusion that she had cared for him always, and Phil Gallatin's indifference had stimulated her interest in him to a degree which made it necessary for her to win him away from Jane Loring at all hazards. She was not in the least unhappy about the matter. Here was a real difficulty to be overcome, the first in personal importance that she had ever faced, and she met it with a smile, aware that all of the arts which a woman may use, and some which she may not, must be brought into play to accomplish her ends. As a matter of fact, Nina's mechanism was working at the highest degree of efficiency, and she was taking a real delight in life, such as she had never before experienced. Since the pot and kettle affair, she had thought much and deeply, had noted Coleman Van Duyn's attentions to Jane Loring and her acceptance of them, had heard with an uncommon interest of their reported engagement, and had kept herself informed as to the goings and comings of Phil Gallatin. And she read Jane Loring as one may read an open book. Their personal relations were the perfection of amiability, They had met informally on several occasions when Nina had noted with well-concealed amusement the slightly exaggerated warmth of Jane's greeting, and had taken care to return this display of friendship in kind. Everything added to the conviction that Jane's love of Phil was only exceeded by her hatred of Nina Jaffray. And yet until this morning Nina had had moments of uncertainty, for the incident Jane had witnessed was too trivial to stand the test of sober second thought. And Jane was just silly enough to forgive and forget it. Nina's visit to Phil Gallatin's office had agreeably surprised her, for Phil had made it perfectly clear that his estrangement from Jane still existed. But to make the matter doubly sure, Nina had decided to play a card she had been holding in reserve. In other words, more smoke was needed, and Nina was prepared to provide the fuel. First, she met Coleman Van Duyn by appointment at her own house, and they had a long chat, during which, without his being aware of it, he was the subject of a searching examination which had for its object the revelation of the exact relation between himself and Miss Loring. Even Coley, it seemed, was not satisfied with this state of affairs. They were not engaged. No, he was willing to admit it, but he had hopes that before the winter was over Miss Loring would see things his way. His dislike of Phil Gallatin was thinly veiled, and Nina played upon it with a skill which left nothing to be desired, to the end that at last Coley came out into the open and declared himself flat-footed. "I don't know your relations with him, Nina. Don't care, really. You know your way about and all that sort of thing. But he's going it too strong. I'm tired of beating about the bush. I know a thing or two about Phil Gallatin, and I'll tell 'em soon. It's time people knew the sort of Johnny that fellow is." "Oh, I know, Coley. You're prejudiced. You've got a right to be. A man doesn't want any scandal hanging around the name of the girl he's going to marry. Everybody knows, of course, that Phil and Jane Loring were together last summer up in the woods, and that—" Van Duyn had risen, his eyes more protrusive, his face more purple than was good for him. It was the first time he had heard that story spoken of with such freedom, and it shocked him. "It wasn't Jane," he roared. "She wasn't the only woman in Canada last summer. How do you know it was Jane?" "She admitted it," said Nina sadly. "Oh, she did. Well, what of it? If I don't care, what business is it of anybody else? She suits me, and I'm going to marry her." He stopped and glared at Nina as though it was she who was the sole author of his unhappiness. Nina only smiled up at him encouragingly. "Of course you are. That's one of the things I wanted to see you about. I think I can help you, Coley, if you'll let me." She made him sit down again, and when he was more composed, went on. "You see, it's this way. I don't mind your running Phil down, if it gives you any pleasure, but you might as well know that I don't share your opinions. He isn't your sort. You don't understand him, and he has managed to come between you and Jane. But I don't see the slightest use in getting excited. These silly romantic affairs of the teens are seldom really dangerous. Phil's infirmities excited her pity." "His infirmities?" "Yes, but Jane Loring isn't the kind of girl to put up with that kind of thing long." "Rather not." "Oh, I don't mean what you do. I mean that she isn't suited to him, that's all. There are other women who might marry him and make something of him." "Who?" he sneered. "I?" she said calmly. Her quiet tone transfixed him. "You want to marry him?" "Yes, and I'm going to. Perhaps you understand now how we can help each other." "By George, I hadn't an idea, Nina. I knew you'd been flirting with him and all that, but marriage." She nodded. "You are a good sort," he grinned. "Do you really mean it?" "Of course I'll help you if I can, but I hardly see." "You don't have to see. Jane Loring may still have a fancy for Phil Gallatin, but it ought to be perfectly obvious that she can't marry him if he's going to marry me. All I want you to do just now is to make yourself necessary to Jane Loring. Propose to her again tomorrow." And then with convincing assurance, "I think she'll accept you." "You do? Why?" "That, if you'll pardon me, is a matter I do not care to discuss." She arose and dismissed him gracefully, and Van Duyn wandered forth into Gramercy Park with a feeling very like that of a timorous hospital patient who has for the first time been subjected to the X-ray. Nina lunched alone, then dressed for the afternoon and ordered her machine. She had made no mistake in presupposing that Jane Loring's curiosity would outweigh her prejudices. In their talk upon the telephone there had been a slight hesitation, scarcely noticeable, on Jane's part, after which she had expressed herself as delighted at the opportunity of seeing Nina at the Loring house. Miss Jaffray entered the portals of the vast establishment, her slender figure lost in the great drawing room as she moved restlessly from one object of art to another, awaiting her hostess like a mischievous and lonely bacillus newly liberated into a new field of endeavor. "Nina, dear," said Jane effusively as she entered. "So sweet of you. I haven't really had a chance to have a talk with you for ages." "How wonderfully pretty you look, Jane. I'm simply wild with envy of you." It was the feminine convention. Each pecked the other just once below the eye, and each wished that the other had never been born. Jane led the way into the library where they sat side by side on the big divan, where they both skillfully maneuvered for an opening for a while, feinting and parrying carte and tierce, advancing, retreating, neither of them willing to risk a thrust. But at last, the preliminaries having given her the touch of her opponent's foil, Nina returned. "You're really the success of the season, Jane. And, you know, when a back number like I am admits a thing like that about a debutante, it's pretty apt to be true. But the thing I can't understand is why you want to end it all and marry." "Marry whom?" "Coley." "Oh? You have some private source of information on the subject?" Jane asked pleasantly. "None but your own actions," Nina replied coolly. "It's funny, too, because I've had an idea ever since that Dryad story. I've feared that you were rather keen on Phil Gallatin." Nina was forced to admiration of the carelessness of Jane's parry. "Mr. Gallatin?" she said, her eyes wide with wonder. "What in the world made you think of him? If I was ever grateful to the man for his kindness up there in the woods, every instinct in me revolted at the memory of what people said of us. Do you think I could care for a man who would let a thing like that be told?" She hesitated a moment and then added, "Besides, there are other reasons why Mr. Gallatin and I could never be friends." "Oh, I see," Nina said slowly, her gaze on the fire. "You know, I'm very fond of Phil, and though you may not approve of him, he's really one of the best fellows in the world." Well, why don't you marry him? Said Jane carelessly. Marry me? Nina laughed softly up at the portrait over the mantel. Good Lord, Jane, you want to bridle me. No, thanks. I've only one life, you know, and I hardly feel like spending it on the Bridge of Sighs. My recording angel wouldn't stand domestication. She's on the point of giving up the job already. I suppose I'll have to marry some day, but when I do, I'll select the quiet, elderly widower of some capable person who has trained him properly. A well-trained husband may be a dull blessing, but he's safe. Not Phil Gallatin, my dear. The girl who marries Phil will have her hands full. But he's such a dear, so solemn, so innocent looking, as though butter wouldn't melt in his mouth. And yet she paused and sighed audibly. Jane glanced at her and was silent. I've never thought of Phil as a marrying man, Nina went on. The thing is impossible, and I'd very much rather have him as he is. But it does seem a pity about him, because he has so many virtues, and he really makes love like an angel. Does he? Asked Jane, yawning politely. But then so many men do that. Yes, I suppose so. But Phil is different somehow. Jane laughed. Yes, I gathered that at the Pot and Kettle. Nina glanced up and away. You did see. It's a pity. I'm sorry. Quite imprudent of me, wasn't it? I suppose I ought to be horribly mortified, but I'm not. I've reached a point where I'm quite hardened to people's opinions, even to yours, Jane. But I confess I was bothered a little about that. I am glad you don't care for Phil, because it would have been awkward and it might have made a difference in our friendship. You'd have been sorry, wouldn't you? Jane swallowed. Oh, of course I would. But it doesn't matter now whether you saw or not, because I'm sure that you and Coley understand. I'm not sure that I do understand, said Jane with a smile toward the cloisonné jar at the window. As a form of diversion, I can't say that kissing has ever appealed to me. But then, you know, Jane, you're very young. May I say verdant? It's an innocent amusement, if considered so. The harm of it is in considering it harmful. You're a hopeless little Puritan. I can't see how you and I have got along so well. I suppose it's because we're so different. Yes, perhaps that's it. But I'm sure we wouldn't be nearly so friendly if we ever interfered with each other. I'm glad we haven't, Jane darling. I've really gotten into the way of depending on your friendship. You don't think I've strained it a little today by my modern view of old conventions? Not at all. For a Puritan, I'm surprisingly liberal. I don't care at all whom my friends kiss or why. It's none of my affair. I'd hardly make it so unless I was asked to. Nina laid her fingers on Jane's arm. But we do understand each other, don't we, Jane? Yes, wonderfully. I'm so glad that you think it worthwhile to confide in me. I do. You're so sensible and tolerant. I'm almost too much of a free thinker for most people, and they're ready to believe almost anything of me. But you don't care what they say, do you, Jane? No, I don't, Nina. It wouldn't make the slightest difference to me what people said of you. And this was the truth. Perhaps the first truth, in fact, or by inference, which either of them had uttered. So far, so good. Honors were even, Each of them was aware that the other was a hypocrite. Each of them was playing the game of hide and seek, bringing into play all the arts of dissimulation to which the sex is heir. All is fair in love and war. This was both. Under such conditions, to the feminine conscience, anything is justifiable. Nina had begun the combat with leisurely assurance, Jane with a contempt which fortified her against mishap. The manners of each were friendly and confiding, their tones caressing, but neither of them deceived the other, and each of them knew that she didn't. Nina had taken the initiative. She had a mission, and this was at a slight advantage, for Jane had not yet begun to suspect what that mission was. She had made up her mind, feminine fashion, not to believe what Nina wanted her to believe. But before long she began to find that Nina was mixing truth and fiction with such skill that it was difficult to distinguish one from the other. The dangers of the social jungle develop remarkable perceptions in deer and bird of paradise, but these defensive instincts are not always proof against the craft of the cat tribe. If they were, the cat tribe would long since have ceased to exist as a species. Other things being equal, the stalker of prey has all the advantage. Nina knew that Jane knew that she was lying, so to gain her point she was prepared, if necessary, to use the simple expedient of telling the truth. Nina was leaning forward, her chin in her hand, her gaze on the rug. "You've heard, I suppose, this story people are telling about Phil and me?" she said in a lower tone. "No," said Jane in tones of curiosity. "Is it something very dreadful?" "I'm afraid it is. At least, people seem to think it so. It began with an accident to my motor and ended at a parlor heater." "A parlor heater? Do go on, Nina. I'm immensely interested." "Phil and I, on the way home from Egerton's party, you remember? He went home in my motor. I know people thought it awfully rude of us, as the other motors were so crowded, but it just happened so, and we started home alone after all the others had gone. We ran out of oil and had to put up for the night while we could. Unfortunate, wasn't it? We were miles from nowhere and not a gallon of gasoline in sight. The farmer seemed to think we were suspicious characters, but he let us in at last to sit beside his stove until morning. I'm sure he was peeping over the balusters most of the time to be sure we didn't make off with the family Bible." Nina laughed at the recollection, a little more loudly than seemed necessary. "Phil was very sweet about it all. He was so afraid of compromising me, poor fellow. I really felt very sorry for him. The farmer wouldn't volunteer to help us, so Phil wanted to trudge the 5 miles through the snow to get the oil, but I wouldn't let him. I couldn't, Jane. It was frightfully lonely there. The chauffeur was drunk and I was afraid." You were quite right," said Jane in a suppressed tone. Nina glanced at her and went on. "We sat all night huddled in our furs on the opposite sides of that dreadful parlor stove. I don't think I can ever forget it. I've never been so miserable in my life. Never. We spoke to each other in monosyllables for a while, and at last I went to sleep in disgust. I woke up with a frightful pain in my back from that dreadful chair. What a night! And to think that it was for this that Phil and I have been talked about. It's maddening, Jane. If we only had given them a little flame, just a tiny one, for all this smoke. Poor Phil. He was terribly provoked about it this morning. He wants to kill that wretched chauffeur, for of course the whole story came from him. You know, Jane, I discharged him as soon as we got back to town, and this was his revenge. Sweet, wasn't it? It seems as if one was very much at the mercy of one's mechanician. They're servants, of course, but you can never get them to think that they are. I haven't dared tell father. I don't know what he would do about it. I'm afraid." Jane Loring had risen and was looking out of the window into the gathering dusk. "What's the use, Nina?" she asked quietly. "The use of what?" "Telling me all this. I understand, I think." "I hope you do," said Nina quickly. "I wanted you to. That's why I told you." She got up and took a few rapid paces forward. "Jane!" she cried suddenly. "What do you mean? That you believe? Oh, how could you?" She stood a moment, her face hidden in her hands as though the horror of it all had just come to her. Jane Loring faced around calmly, her face grave. "What difference does it make what I believe?" she asked. Nina looked at her a long while, then dropped her gaze, turned away and picked up her accessories. Her mission here was ended. "I'm sorry. I seem to have misjudged you your friendship." "Yes," said Jane. "I think perhaps you have." Nina moved toward the door and Jane, motionless, watched her. She did not speak again, nor did Jane, and in a moment the door closed between them for the last time. Nina was smiling when she entered her machine, but Jane climbed the stairs wearily. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of The Silent Battle by George Gibbs, recording by Tony Oliva. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Mouse and the Lion. There was an activity in the offices of Kenyon, Hood and Gallatin, chiefly centering around the doings of the youngest member of the firm, which had caused the methodical Tooker some skeptical and unquiet moments. He had witnessed these spurts of industry before, and remembered that they had always presaged the bursting of a bubble and the disappearance of the junior partner for a protracted period, at the end of which he would return to the office pale, nervous and depressed. But as the weeks went by, far beyond the time usually marked for this event, Tooker began to realize that something unusual had happened. The chief clerk could hardly be called an observant man, for his business in life kept him in a narrow groove. But he awoke one morning to the discovery that a remarkable change had taken place in the manner and bearing of Mr. Gallatin. There were none of those fidgety movements of the fingers, that quick and sometimes overbearing speech, or the habit Mr. Gallatin had had, as his father had had it before him, of pacing up and down the floor of his room, his hands behind his back, his brows bent over sullen eyes. Mr. Gallatin's manner and speech were quieter, his gaze more direct and more lasting. He smiled more, and his capacity for work seemed unlimited. Tooker waited for a long while and then came to the conclusion that a new order of things had begun and that the junior partner had found himself. There had been frequent important conferences in Mr. Kenyon's office between the partners, during which Philip Gallatin had advised the firm of the progress of the Sanborn case. But it was clear that for the present at least, the junior partner dominated the situation. All his life Tooker had been accustomed to follow in the footsteps of others, and was prepared to follow Gallatin gladly if the junior partner would give him footsteps to follow. and he was now beginning to appreciate the significance of those long visits of Mr. Gallatin in Pennsylvania and the infinite care and study with which Gallatin had fortified himself. He understood, too, what those piles of documents on Mr. Gallatin's desk were for, and in the conferences of the firm, when John Kenyon's incisive voice cut in, he realized that it was more often in encouragement, advice, and appreciation than in contention or argument. The Sanborn Company's directors were represented by the firm of Whitehead, Leupold, Tyson, and Leupold. This was one of the firms previously mentioned which had offices upon an upper floor and included among its clients many large corporations closely identified with the interests. A correspondence had been passing between Mr. Gallatin and Mr. Leupold, with all of which Tooker was familiar. Mr. Gallatin's early letters stated that he hoped for a conference with Mr. Loring. Mr. Leupold's first replies were couched in polite formulas, the equivalent of which was in plain English that Mr. Gallatin might go to the devil, saying that Mr. Loring had nothing to do with the matter. Mr. Gallatin's reply ignored this suggestion and again proposed a conference. Mr. Leupold refused in abrupt terms. Mr. Gallatin gave reasons for his request. Mr. Leupold couldn't see them. Mr. Gallatin patiently gave other reasons. Mr. Leupold ignored this letter. Mr. Gallatin wrote another. Mr. Leupold in reply considered the matter closed. Mr. Gallatin considered the matter just opened. Mr. Leupold fulminated politely and satirically suggested intimidation. Mr. Gallatin regretted Mr. Leupold's implication, but persisted, giving as his reasons the discovery of material evidence. The next day Mr. Leupold came in person, was shown into Mr. Gallatin's office, and Tooker had been present at the interview. It had been a memorable occasion. Mr. Leupold wore that suave and confident manner for which he was noted, and Gallatin received him with an old-fashioned courtesy and the deference of a younger man for an older, which left nothing to be desired. Accepting this as his due, Leupold began in a fatherly way to impress upon Gallatin the utter futility of trying to win the injunction in the Court of Appeals. The contentions of Sanborn et al. Had no basis either in law or in equity. Mr. Gallatin had doubtless been unduly influenced by doubtful precedents. He, Leupold, was familiar with every phase of the case and had defended the previous suit, which had been brought and lost by a legal firm in Philadelphia. There was absolutely nothing in Mr. Gallatin's position as stated in his correspondence, and he concluded by referring his young friend to certain marked passages in a volume which he had brought in under his arm. Gallatin read the passages through with interest and listened with a show of great seriousness to Mr. Leupold's interpretation of them. Mr. Leupold had a mien which commanded attention. Gallatin gave it, but he said little in reply which could indicate his possible ground of action, except to express regret that Mr. Leupold's clients had taken such an intolerant view of his own client's claims, and to deplore the unfortunate tone of Mr. Leupold's own letter of some days ago. When it was quite clear to Mr. Leupold that the young man was not to be moved by persuasion, his manner changed. "I have done my best, Mr. Gallatin," he said irritably, "to prove to you the utter futility of your course. My clients have nothing to fear. I am only trying to save them the expense of further litigation. But if you insist on bringing this case to trial, we will welcome the opportunity to show further evidence in our possession. We have been content, for the sake of peace, to let matters go on as they have been going. But if this suit is pressed, I warn you that it will be unfortunate for your clients." "I hope not. I hope we won't have to bring suit," replied Gallatin easily. "I'm only asking for a conference of all the parties interested, Mr. Leuppold. That certainly is little enough. An amicable conference, a discussion, if you like." "There is nothing to discuss." "I beg to differ." Leaving aside for a moment the question of the new evidence in the Sanborn case, "Do you think that Mr. Loring, who controls its stock, would care to have his connection with the Lehigh and Pottsville Railroad Company brought into court?" Mr. Leuppold gasped. He couldn't help it. How and where had this polite but surprising young man obtained this information, which no member of his own firm besides himself possessed? It was uncanny. Was this the fellow they had talked about and smiled over upstairs? Mr. Leuppold took to cover skillfully, hiding his uneasiness under a bland smile. "You're dreaming, sir," he said. Gallatin shook his head. "No, I'm not dreaming." Gallatin rose and took a few paces up and down the room. "See here, Mr. Leuppold, I'm not prepared to discuss the matter further now. I've asked you for a conference and you call my request intimidation, which might mean an uglier thing. You've treated my correspondence in a casual way, and you've patronized me in my own office. I've kept my temper pretty well, and I'm keeping it still. But I warn you that you have been and still are making a mistake. I've asked for a conference because I believe this matter can be settled out of court, and because I didn't think it fair to your client to go to court without giving him a chance to save himself. We have no desire to enter into a long and expensive litigation, but we are prepared to do so and will take the preliminary steps at once, unless we have some immediate consideration of our claims. If you stand suit on this appeal, you will lose, and I fancy the evidence presented will be of such character that you will not care to take the matter further. Don't reply now, Mr. Leuppold. Think it over, and let me hear from you in writing." Mr. Leuppold had not moved. He was watching Gallatin keenly from under his beetling brows. Was this mere guesswork? What did the young man really know? What evidence had he? Was it a bluff? If so, he made it in tones with which Leuppold was unfamiliar. But it was no time to backwater now. He smiled approvingly at Phil Gallatin's inkwell. "Mr. Gallatin, your imagination does you credit. A good lawyer must have intuition, but he's got to have discretion too. You think, because the interests we represent are wealthy ones, that you can throw a stick in our direction and be sure of hitting something. Unfortunately, you have been misinformed on all points. Mr. Loring has voluntarily submitted his holdings in Pennsylvania to investigation. You can never prove any connection between the Pequot Coal Company and the Lehigh and Pottsville Railroad. There is none." He rose pompously and took up his hat and books. "There isn't any use in our talking over this case. It will lead us nowhere. But I'll promise you, if you'll put your proposition in writing, to submit it to careful consideration." "Thanks," said Gallatin dryly. He picked up a large envelope from the table and handed it to his visitor. "I have already done so. Will you take it with you or shall I mail it?" "You may give it to me, Mr. Gallatin." Gallatin walked to the outer door and politely bowed him out, while Tooker, his thin frame writhing with ecstasy, fussed with some papers on the big table in the junior partner's office until he was more composed, and then went on about his daily routine. He realized now for the first time the full stature of the junior partner. In a night, it almost seemed to Tooker, he had outgrown his boyhood, his brilliant, wayward boyhood that had promised so much and achieved so little. He was like his father now, but there was a difference. Philip Gallatin the elder, he remembered, had dominated his office by the mere force of his intellect. He had directed the preparation of his cases with an unerring legal sense, and he had won them through his mastery of detail and the elimination of the unessential. But it was when presenting his case to a jury that he was at his strongest, for such was the personal quality of his magnetism that jurors were willing to be convinced less by the value of his cause than by the magic of his sophistry. But to Tooker, who was little more than a piece of legal machinery, there was something in the methods of the son which compensated for the more spectacular talents of the father, the painstaking and diligent way in which Gallatin had planned and carried out his present investigations, and the confidence with which he was putting his information to use. It was clear to Tooker that Leuppold had been unprepared for Philip Gallatin's revelations. Even now Tooker doubted the wisdom of them, for Mr. Leuppold would not be slow to take advantage of his information and to cover the traces left by his clients as well as he might. But when he spoke of it to Gallatin, the junior partner had laughed. "Don't you bother, old man. Wait a while. We'll hear from Mr. Leuppold very soon. Before the week is out, I think." In the offices upstairs, Mr. Leuppold's return was the signal for an immediate consultation of the entire firm, which would have flattered and encouraged Philip Gallatin had he been aware of it. Mr. Tyson and Mr. Whitehead discovered in Mr. Leuppold's account of the interview undue cause for alarm. They were themselves adepts at the game Mr. Gallatin was evidently playing, and could be depended upon at the proper moment to outmaneuver him. Mr. Leuppold disagreed and was forced to admit the weakness of Mr. Loring's position, if, as he suspected, Mr. Gallatin had succeeded in fortifying himself with the proper evidence. The stock was, of course, not in Mr. Loring's name, but a man of resource might have been able to find means to establish a legal connection of the mine with the railroad. Mr. Leuppold's opinions usually bore weight, but just now he seemed to have no definite opinions. The conference of the partners lasted until late in the afternoon, during which time messengers came and went between the firm's offices and those of the Pequot Coal Company and that of the president of the L&P. Henry K. Loring was out of town and would not return until the end of the week. A wire was sent to him to return to New York at once, and it was decided that no reply to Mr. Gallatin's letter should be sent until Mr. Loring had been advised. Phil Gallatin, in high good humor, lunched that morning with the senior partner at a fashionable restaurant uptown. His work on the Sanborn case was finished. He had been at it very hard for 2 months, and the two of them had planned to spend the afternoon and following day up at John Kenyon's farm in Westchester, where they would do some riding, some walking, and some resting, of which both were in need. The lunch was a preliminary luxury, and they found a table in a corner on the avenue and ordered. There was no talk of office matters. John Kenyon had been thoroughly advised of Phil's work and knew that there was nothing in the way of suggestion or advice that he could offer. He had noticed for some days the gaunt look in his young partner's face. There were indications of his growing maturity and shadows of the struggle through which he had passed. But there were marks which John Kenyon knew belonged to a different kind of trouble. Gallatin had told him what had happened in the woods, and Kenyon had learned something of Phil's romance in New York. But Kenyon was not given to idle or curious questioning, and he knew that when Phil was ready to speak of private matters, he would do so. Their oysters had been served and their planked fish brought when a fashionable party entered and was conducted by the head waiter to an adjoining table which had been decorated for the occasion. Mrs. Pennington led the way, followed by Miss Ledyard, Mrs. Perrin, and Miss Loring. Behind them followed Ogden Spencer, Bibby Worthington, Colonel Broadhurst, and Coleman Van Duyn, who was, it appeared, the host. Phil had hoped that his presence might pass unnoticed, but Nellie Pennington espied him and nodded gaily, so that he had to rise and greet her. This drew the eyes of others, and when the party was seated, he discovered that Miss Loring, on Van Duyn's right, was seated facing him, and that her eyes, after one blank look in his direction, were assiduously turned elsewhere. John Kenyon caught the change in Gallatin's expression, but in a moment Phil had resumed their conversation upon the comparative merits of the Delaware River and Potomac River shad, and their luncheon went on to its conclusion. But the spirits of John Kenyon's guest had fallen, and Kenyon's most persuasive stories failed to find a response. In spite of himself, Phil Gallatin found himself looking at Jane and thinking of Arcadia. It was 3 weeks now since that much to be remembered and regretted interview at the Loring house had taken place. The glance he stole at Jane assured him that if he had ever had a hope of reconciliation, the chances for it were now more remote than ever. She wore a huge hat which screened her effectually, and the glimpses he had of her face showed it dimpling in smiles for Coleman Van Duyn or Bibby Worthington, who sat on either side of her. When their eyes had first met, he had thought her pale, but as the moments passed, a warm color mounted her cheeks. It seemed to Gallatin that never before, within his memory, had she ever appeared so carefree. She was youth untrammeled, a sister to Euphrosyne, the spirit of joy. It seemed as if she realized that the grim specter which had stolen into her life for a while had been exorcised away, and that she had already forgotten it in the beckoning of the jocund hours. Phil Gallatin had come into her life and gone, leaving no trace in her mind or in her heart. After this their eyes met but once. He was looking at her, thinking of these things, oblivious of what John Kenyon was saying, unaware of the intentness of his gaze, which at last compelled her to look in his direction. It was a startled glance that she gave him, wide-eyed, almost fearful, as though he had challenged her to this silent combat. Then her lids lowered insolently, her chin lifted, and she turned aside. Their coffee had been served. Phil gulped his down hastily. "Come, Uncle John," he said hoarsely. "Let's get out of this, will you?" John Kenyon paid the check and they rose. Unfortunately, the only path to the door lay by Mr. Van Duyn's table, and as Gallatin passed, nodding to his acquaintances, Mrs. Pennington got up and stood in front of him. "I do so want to see you for a moment, Phil. Will you excuse me, Coley?" she said, and led the way into a room where she found an unoccupied corner. John Kenyon went elsewhere to smoke his cigar. "Oh, Phil," she whispered, "why wouldn't you come to see me? I've had so much to talk to you about." I've been very busy, Nellie. I haven't been anywhere." "My house isn't anywhere. I want to talk to you. You know what I mean." "It won't do any good, Nellie," he muttered. "There isn't anything more to be said." "Perhaps not, but I want to say it just the same. I want you to promise." "I can't," he said hoarsely. "Don't ask me to come and talk to you about that." "Well, then, come and talk to me about other things." "I can't. If I come I must talk about what you remind me of." She hesitated, looking at him critically. "Phil, you're an idiot," she said at last. "Thanks," he replied. "I'm aware of it." "Are you going to give up?" "I've given up." Nellie Pennington shrugged. "For good? You're going to let Oh, I've no patience with you." "I'm sorry. You did what you could and I'm thankful. Don't think I'm ungrateful. I'm not. One of these days I'll prove it. You did a lot. I'm awake, Nellie. You woke me and I'm not going to sleep again." "I'm proud of you, Phil, but you're not awake, not really awake, or you couldn't sit by and see the girl you love forced into an engagement with a man she doesn't care for." Gallatin flushed. "Is that," he asked slowly, "is that what this luncheon means?" "Judge for yourself. He's with her always, and they've even rebelled against my chaperonage. Their relations are talked of freely in Jane's presence, and she laughs acquiescence. Imagine it." Gallatin turned away. I have no further interest in Miss Loring," he said quietly. "Well, I have, and I'm not going to let her make a fool of herself if I can help it." "Miss Loring will probably not agree with you." "I hardly expect her to." She hesitated. "Phil," she asked at last. "What, Nellie?" "Will you answer a question?" "What?" "Was this story they're telling about you and Nina mentioned?" "Yes, it was." "I thought so," triumphantly. "Phil, we must talk this thing out." "It can do no good." "And no harm. There's been a mistake somewhere, something neither you nor I understand." She stopped and tapped her forehead with her index finger. "I can't tell what, but I sense it here. Something has gone wrong. What, I don't know. I've got to think about it." "Yes, it's gone wrong and it can't be righted." "Perhaps not," she said, rising. "But I do want you to come to see me. Won't you?" "You're very persistent, aren't you? Very well, I'll come." "I must go now. Coley will be furious. I hope so, at any rate." She smiled at him again and went back to her luncheon party while Gallatin found John Kenyon and drove to the Grand Central Station. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of The Silent Battle by George Gibbs. Recording by Tony Oliva. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Diamond cut diamond. It was the middle of March, and fashionable New York, having been at least twice through its winter wardrobe, had gone southward for a change of speed. Aiken, Jekyll Island, and Palm Beach had all done their share in the midwinter rejuvenation, but the particular set of people with which this story concerns itself were spending the last days of the Lenten season at the Dorsey Martins' place in Virginia. Dorsey Martin was rich beyond the dreams of Alnaschar, but unlike the unfortunate brother of the barber, had not smashed the glassware in his basket until he had sold it to somebody else, when he was enabled to buy it in again at a much reduced rate. His particular specialty was not glassware, but railroads, which, while equally fragile, could be put together again and made, to all appearances, as good as new. The fruits of this fortunate talent were in evidence in his well-appointed house in New York, with its collection of old English portraits, his palace at Newport just finished, and in his shooting place in Virginia. The Dorsey Martins had arrived. They had been 10 years in transit, and their ways had been devious. But their present welcome more than compensated for the pains and money which had been spent in the pilgrimage. The Virginia place, Clovelly, adjoined that of the Ledyards, and consisted of 1,000 acres of preserved woodland and dale within a night's journey of New York. Autumn, of course, was the season when Clovelly was most in use. But spring frequently found it the scene of gay gatherings such as the present one, for in addition to the squash courts and swimming pool, there was court tennis, with a marker constantly in attendance, a good stable, and hospitable neighbors. It was Nellie Pennington who had prevailed upon Phil Gallatin to accept Mrs. Dorsey Martin's invitation, for she knew that Jane Loring was staying at Mobjack, the Ledyards' place, and she hoped that she might yet be the means of bringing the two together. Her interview with Phil had been barren of results, except to confirm her in the suspicion that Nina Jaffray held the key to the puzzle. Nina, who had been one of the early arrivals at Clovelly, had so far eluded all her snares, and Nellie Pennington was now convinced that here was a foeman worthy of her subtlest metal. She enjoyed the game hugely, as apparently did Nina, and their passages at arms were as skillful and as ineffectual as those of two perfectly matched maîtres d'escrime. Nina knew that Nellie Pennington suspected her of mischief, but she also knew that it was unlikely that any one would ever know, unless from Jane, just what that mischief had been. The arrival of Phil Gallatin, while it gave Nina happiness, made her keep a narrower guard against the verbal thrusts of her playful adversary. Phil Gallatin had regained his poise and reached Clovelly in a jubilant frame of mind. 2 days ago Henry K. Loring had agreed to a conference. Mr. Leupold, more suave, more benign, more patronizing than ever, had called and told Gallatin of this noteworthy act of condescension on the part of his client. Nothing, of course, need be expected from such a meeting in the way of concessions, but men of the world like Mr. Leupold and Mr. Gallatin knew that cooperation was, after all, the soul of business, and that one caught many more flies with treacle than with vinegar. He continued for half an hour in this vein, platitudinizing and begging the question at issue, while Gallatin listened and assented politely, without giving any further intimation of a course of action for Kenyon, Hood and Gallatin. But when the great lawyer had departed, Gallatin went to the window and surveyed the steel gray waters of the Hudson with a gleaming eye, and his face wore a smile which would not depart. Sanborn's case would never go to court. The vestiges of this good humor still remained upon his face and in his demeanor all the morning, which had been spent in a run with the Warrington pack. It was so long since he had ridden to hounds that he had almost forgotten the joy of it. But he was well mounted and finished creditably. Nina Jaffray showed the field her heels for most of the way, and Gallatin pounded after her, his muscles aching, determined not to be outridden by a woman. In the first check, she drew her horse alongside of his and smiled at him. "Ready to let me announce it yet, Phil?" she asked. Gallatin just then was wondering whether his leg grip would last out the day. "Announce what, Nina?" he asked. "Our engagement." She returned with a smile. "It's almost time, you know." "Oh, go as far as you like." "Don't laugh." "I've got to. You make me so happy." "Oh, you can joke if you like now, but you'll have to marry me some day." "Oh, will I? Why?" "Because you like me. Friendship subdues even time, Phil. I'm willing to wait." And when he looked at her, at loss for a reply, the hounds gave tongue again and they were off at a full gallop. He couldn't help admiring her this morning. The easy unconventionality of her speech, her attitude of good fellowship, were a part of the setting. This was the scene in which she always appeared to the best advantage, and she took the center of the stage with an assurance which showed how well she knew her lines. It was Nina's brush, of course, for she had brought down her own best hunter for the occasion, and was in at the death with the huntsman and master of the hounds, while Gallatin trailed in with the field. And in the ride homeward, Phil found himself jogging along comfortably at Nina's side. "Phil," she said again, when the others had ridden on ahead, "I hope you won't laugh at me any more. It's indecent. I never laugh at you." "Oh, don't you? You're never doing anything else." "It seems so, doesn't it? That's my pose, Phil. I'm really very much in earnest about things. I don't suppose I ever could learn to love anybody. The faculty is lacking, somehow. But I think you know that even if I didn't love you, I'd never love anyone else, whatever happened, and I'd be true as death." "Yes, I know that. But she repeated. "But I'm not going to marry," he laughed. She shrugged. "Oh, yes, you will some day." "Why do you think so?" "Because men of your type always do." "My type?" "Yes. They usually marry late and beneath them. I'm trying to save you from that mistake." He smiled at her saucy profile. "Marrying one's equal doesn't always mean equality." "You are always a dreamer, Phil." "I think I'll always dream then, Nina," he broke in abruptly. "Don't make the mistake of thinking that you've got to marry somebody, anybody, just because you've reached the marriageable age. That's the trap that catches most of us. Marry for love, Nina. You've got that much capital to begin on. Love doesn't die a sudden death. Not unless it's killed. That happens, you know. You can't kill it easily. You may scoff at it, deny it, wound it, but it doesn't die, Nina." She turned and examined him narrowly, then shifted her bridle to the other hand and ran her crop along her horse's neck. "You know, Jane Loring is going to marry Coley." "What has that to do with what we're talking about?" he said quickly. "Oh, nothing. Only I thought you'd like to know it. You'll have a chance to congratulate them tonight." Tonight. Where? They're at the Ledyards, but they're dining at Clovelly. Oh. So, if you're going to put them asunder, you'd better do it tonight, or forever hold your peace. He smiled around at her calmly. Nothing doing, Nina. You missed it that time. The only things I'm putting asunder are a railroad and an omnivorous coal company. That takes about all my energy. Phil, she put in thoughtfully after a moment. What? What's the use of waiting? You're going to marry me in the end, you know. Oh, am I? Yes. You can't afford to refuse. I've got the money, position, and father has influence. That means power for a man of your ability. You're getting ambitious. I can tell that by the way you're sticking at things. There's no telling what you mightn't accomplish with the help I can bring you. Oh, you could get along alone, of course, but you'd waste a lot of time. You'd better think about it seriously. I have thought about it. I'm really beginning to believe you mean it. Yes, I do mean it. I've decided to marry you. And you know I've never yet failed at anything I've undertaken. She was quite in earnest, and he looked at her amusedly. Then I suppose I'd better surrender at discretion. Yes, I'm sure you had. Isn't there a loophole? None whatever. I'm your Superman, Phil. You might just as well go at once and order your wedding garments and the ring. It will save us endless discussions, and you know I hate discussions. They're really very wearing. Besides, oh, Phil. She laid the end of her crop on his arm. Just think of what a lot of fun you'll get out of letting Jane know how little you care. Gallatin didn't reply, and in a moment they had reached the stables of Clovelly, where the others were dismounting. In his room, to which he had gone in search of his pipe, Gallatin paused at the window, looking out over the winter landscape, thinking, why not? Why shouldn't he marry her? It would be a cold-blooded business, of course, but he called to mind a dozen marriages of reason that had turned out satisfactorily, and as many marriages for love which had ended in the ditch. This life was a pleasant kind of poison, the luxury and ease, the careless gaiety of these pleasant people who moved along the line of least resistance, taking from life only what suited their moods, living only for the moment, sure that the future was amply provided for. He had turned his back on this world for a while and had lived in another, a sterner world, with which this one had little in common. A place like this might be his, with its broad acres and stables, horses and motor cars, a life like this for the asking, a marriage of reason, with Nina Jaffray at the helm of his destiny and hers. God forbid! He had laid his own course now, but he had weathered the rocks and shoals, and the rough water in sight did not dismay him. Marriage. He wanted none of it with Nina or any other. This kind of life was not for him unless he won it for himself, for only then would he be fit to live it, and while he found it good to be away from his rooms in the house in Street, good to be away from the office for a while, the atmosphere of Clovelly was redolent of his early days of indolence and undesire, and he suddenly found himself less tolerant of the failings of these people than he had ever been before. He hadn't realized what his work had meant until he had this idleness to compare it with. Jane. He had been able to think less of Jane Loring in the fever of work. But here at Clovelly, among the people they both knew, where her name was frequently mentioned, he found it less easy to forget her, and the imminence of the hour when he must see her again gave him a qualm. He lighted his pipe and started downstairs toward the gun room, where the guests were recounting the adventures of the morning over tobacco and highballs. Nellie Pennington, who had an instinct for the psychological moment, met him and led him to a lounge at the end of the hall. "Well," she said, "are you prepared to give a full account of yourself?" "An empty account, dear mother confessor. I'm neither sinful nor virtuous." "I'm not so sure about that." "About which?" "About either. You're unpleasantly self-righteous and criminally unamiable." "Oh, Nellie, to whom?" "To me. Also, you're stupid." "Thanks. That's my misfortune. What else?" "That's enough to begin on. I could pull your ears in chagrin. You've treated my advice with the scantest ceremony, made ducks and drakes of the opportunities I've provided, and lastly you've gone and gotten Nina Jaffray talked about." "Nellie, please. I can't permit." "Oh, fudge, Phil. Nina is well able to look after herself. It isn't of Nina I'm thinking." "Who then?" "You silly goose. There isn't any spectacle in the world half so ludicrous as a chivalrous man defending the fame of a woman who doesn't care whether she's defended or not." "I don't see." "I know you don't. That's why I'm telling you." "But Nina does care." "Yes, but not precisely in the way that you suppose. Fortune gave her some excellent cards, and she played them." "Please be more explicit." "Very well, then. Girls of Nina's type would rather have their name coupled unpleasantly with that of the man they care for than not coupled with it at all." "Nonsense. Nina doesn't care." "Oh, yes, she does. She wants to marry you. She has told you so, hasn't she?" Phil Gallatin looked at her quickly with eyes agog. Such powers of divination were uncanny. "She has proposed to you once, twice, how many times, Phil?" "None. Not at all," he stammered, while she smiled and shrugged her incredulity. "If I didn't know already, I need only a glance at your face to be convinced of it." "How did you know?" "How does a woman know anything? By virtue, my friend, of those invisible spiritual fibers which she thrusts in all directions and upon which she receives impressions. That's how she knows." "You guessed." "Call it that if you like. I guessed. I guessed this also, that Nina wanted Jane to believe this story to be true. It didn't need much to convince her. That little Nina was willing to provide." "What?" "Nina admitted that the story was true," she repeated. Gallatin rose to his feet and stared at his companion like one possessed. "Nina admitted it? You're dreaming." "No, I'm very wide awake. I wish you were." "It's preposterous. Whatever put such an idea into your head?" "My antennae." "Nonsense." "Listen. Nina called on Jane a while ago. They had a long talk. Something happened, something that has interrupted friendly relations. They don't speak now. What do you suppose that talk was about? The weather or the plan for the amelioration of the condition of homeless cats?" "Oh, you know a lot about women, Phil Gallatin," she finished scornfully. "I know enough," he muttered. "You think you do," she put in quickly. "The Lord give me patience to talk to you. For unbiased ignorance, next to the callous youth who thinks he knows it all, commend me to the modern Galahad. The one only thinks he knows, but the other doesn't want to know. He's content to believe every woman irreproachable by the mere virtue of being a woman. Nina Jaffray has played her cards with remarkable cleverness, but she has been quite unscrupulous. It's time you knew it, and it's time that Jane did. I would tell her if I thought she would believe me, but I fancy I've meddled enough." Gallatin took 2 or 3 paces up and down and then sat down beside her. "It isn't meddling, Nellie," he said quietly. "You've done your best and I'm grateful to you. Unfortunately, you can't help me any longer. It's too late. I did what I could. No girl who had ever loved a man could let him go so easily, could doubt him so willingly. It was all a mistake. It's better to find it out now than too late." Nellie Pennington didn't reply. She only looked down at her muddy boots with the cryptic smile that women wear when they wish to conceal either their ignorance or their wisdom. "Did you know that Jane was dining here tonight?" she asked. "Yes," he replied. "Nina told me. I'm sorry." "It doesn't matter in the least. The world is big enough for everybody. Jane evidently thinks so, too. Otherwise she wouldn't be coming." "Does she know I'm here?" "Oh, yes. She knows that Nina is, too." Gallatin looked out of the window. "You don't understand women, do you, Phil? Admit that, and I'll tell you why she's coming." He smiled. "I do admit it. You're all in league with the devil." "She's coming here because she wants to show you how little she cares, because she has a morbid curiosity to see you and Nina together. And lastly," at this she leaned toward him with her lips very close to his ear, "and lastly because she loves you more madly than ever." He had hardly recovered from the shock of surprise at this announcement when he realized that Nellie Pennington had suddenly risen and fled. This preliminary step taken, Nellie Pennington retreated upstairs in the most amiable of moods to dress for luncheon. If Nina was going to play the game with marked cards, it was quite proper that Phil be permitted the use of the code. She had at least provided him with food for reflection, which, while not quite pleasant to take, would serve as nutrition for his failing optimism, and somewhere in the back of her head a plan was being born, unpalpable as yet and formless, but which persisted in growing in spite of her. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of The Silent Battle by George Gibbs. Recording by Tony Oliva. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Deep water. The afternoon was passed in leisurely fashion. The modern way of entertaining guests is to let them entertain themselves. They loafed, smoked, played bottle pool, and later on there was a court tennis match between young Dorsey Martin and the Marker, which drew a gallery and applause. Nina Jaffray tried it next with Bibby Worthington, and though she had played but once, got the knack of the railroad service and succeeded in beating him handily amid derisive remarks for Bibby from the nets. A plunge in the pool followed, after which the ladies went up for a rest before dressing for dinner. Gallatin saw little of Nellie Pennington during the afternoon, and though he wanted to question her to satisfy the alarming curiosity which she had aroused, she avoided speaking to him alone, and when he insisted on following her about, fled to her room. She knew the effect of her revelations upon his mind, and she didn't propose that it should be spoiled by an anti-climax. The dinner hour arrived, and with it the Ledyards and their house guests. Angela Wetherill, Millicent Reeves, the Perrins, Jane Loring, Percy Endicott, Coleman Van Duyn, and some of the Warrington folk. Dinner tables, each with 6 chairs, had been laid in the dining room and hall, but so perfect was the machinery of the great establishment that the influx of guests made no apparent difference in its orderly procedure. There were good-natured comments on Bibby Worthington's defeat in the afternoon, congratulations for Nina Jaffray on her dual achievement, uncomplimentary remarks about Virginia Clay, flattering ones about Virginia hospitality, and the usual discussion about breeds of hounds and horses, back of which was to be discovered the ancient rivalry between the Cedarcroft and Appowomeck hunt clubs. Nellie Pennington directed the destinies of the table at which Gallatin sat. Nina Jaffray was on his right, Larry Kane beyond her, Coleman Van Duyn on Mrs. Pennington's left, and Jane Loring opposite. Nothing could possibly have been arranged which could conspire more thoroughly to lacerate the feelings of those assembled. Gallatin saw Jane halt when she was directed to her seat. He heard Nina's titter of delight beside him, caught Larry Kane's glare and Coley Van Duyn's flush, but the stab of Jane's eyes hardened him into an immediate gaiety, in which Nina was not slow to follow. Mrs. Pennington, having devised the situation, calmly sat and proceeded to enjoy it. Good breeding, she knew, made a fair amalgam of the most heterogeneous elements, but she gave a short sigh when they were all seated and each began talking rapidly to his neighbor, Jane to Larry Kane, Nina to Phil, and herself to Coley. Pangs in every heart except her own. It was the perfection of social cruelty, and she enjoyed it hugely, aware that 2, perhaps 3, of the persons at the table might never care to speak to her again, but stimulated by the reflection, whether for bad or good, something must come out of her crucible. The first shock of dismay over, it was apparent that her dinner partners had decided to make the best of the situation. The table was small and general conversation inevitable, but she chose for the present to let matters take their course, trusting to Nina to provide that element of uncertainty which was to make the plot of her comedy fruitful. Indeed, Nina seemed in her element, and when a sudden silence fell, broke the ice with a carelessness which showed her quite oblivious of its existence. "So nice of you, Nellie, to have us all together. I was just saying to Phil that dinners at small tables can be such a bore, if the people are not all congenial." "Jolly, isn't it?" laughed Nellie. "Jane, why weren't you hunting this morning?" "Oh, Coley didn't want to," she said quickly, her rapier flashing in 2 directions. Nellie Pennington understood. "You are getting heavy, aren't you, Coley?" she asked sweetly. "Didn't Honora have anything up to your weight?" "I didn't ask," returned Van Duyn peevishly. "Dreadful bore huntin'." "Hear the man!" exclaimed Nellie. "You're spoiling him, Jane." "There's no hope for any creature who doesn't like hunting," put in Nina in disgust. "Except the fox," said Gallatin. "And there's not much for him when Nina rides," laughed Larry Kane. "Lord, Nina, but you did take some chances today." "I believe in taking chances," put in Miss Jaffray calmly. "The element of uncertainty is all that makes life worth while. Nothing in the world is so deadly as the obvious." "You'll be kept busy avoiding it," sighed Nellie. "I've been." "Oh, I simply ignore it," she returned with a quick gesture. "Jane won't approve, of course, but the unusual, the daring, the unconventional are the only things that interest me at all." They interest others when you do them, Nina," Jane replied, smiling calmly. "Of course they do. And you ought to be grateful." "We are. I'm sure we'd be very dull without you. Personally, I'm a bromide." "Heaven forbid. The things that are easiest are not worth trying for. Whether your game is fish, fowl or beast, and that includes man, try the most difficult. The thrill of delight when you bag your game is worth all the pains of the effort, isn't it, Nellie?" "I don't know," the other replied between oysters. "I bagged Dick, but then I didn't have to try very hard. I suppose I would have bagged him just the same. A woman can have any man she wants, you know." "The trouble is," laughed Larry Kane, "that she doesn't know what she wants." "And if she does, Larry," said Gallatin slowly, "he's usually the wrong one." Nina laughed. "His sex must be blamed for that. The right men are all wrong and the wrong men are all right. That's my experience. Young saint, old devil. Young devil, old saint. You couldn't provide me with a better recommendation for a good husband than a bad reputation as a bachelor. And think of the calm delights of regeneration." "You'll have no difficulty in finding him, Nina," said Jane. "I'm afraid there's no hope for me," laughed Kane. "I, for one, am too good for any use." "Too good to be true," sniffed Nina. "Or too true to be interesting," he added below his breath. Nellie Pennington, having led her companions into deep water, now turned and guided them into the shoals of the commonplace. Jane Loring's eyes and Phil Gallatin's had met across the table. The act was unavoidable, for they sat directly opposite each other, and though each looked away at once, the current established, brief as it was burdened with meaning. Gallatin read 100 things, but love was not one of them. Jane read 100 things, any one of which might have been love, but, as far as she knew, was not. Gallatin caught the end of a gaze she had given him while he was talking to Nina, and he fancied it to be a kind of indignant curiosity, not in the slightest degree related to the scorn of her surprise at being detected in the midst of her inspection. Gallatin found her face thinner, which made her eyes seem larger, and the shadows under them deeper. He had seen fresh young beauty such as hers break and fade during one season in New York, but it shocked him a little to find these marks so evident in so short a time. It was as though a year, 2 years even, had been crowded into the few weeks since he had seen her last, as though she had lived at high tension, letting nothing escape her that could add to the sum of experience. Her eyes sparkled, and on her cheeks was a patch of red clearly defined, like rouge, but not rouge, for it came and went with her humor. She had grown older, more intense, more fragile, her features more clearly carved, more refined and, except for the hard little shadows at the corners of her lips, more spiritual. He glanced at the heavy, bovine face of Coley Van Duyn beside her and wondered. Coley had been drinking freely, and his face was flushed, his laugh open-mouthed and louder than Nellie Pennington's humor seemed to warrant. How could she? God, how could she do it? A blind rage came upon Gallatin, a sudden wave of intolerance and rebellion, and he clenched his fists beneath the table. This man drank as much as he liked and when he pleased. He was the club glutton. He ate immoderately and drank immoderately because he liked to do it and because that was his notion of comfort. Not, as had been the case with Gallatin, because he had not been able to live without it. Van Duyn could stop drinking when he liked, when he had had enough, when he didn't want any more. He drank for the mere pleasure of drinking. Gallatin bit his lip and stared at his untouched wine glasses. Pleasure? With Gallatin it had been no pleasure. It had been a medicine, a desperate remedy for a desperate pain, a poisonous medicine which cured and killed at the same time. "Phil!" Nina's voice sounded suddenly at his ear. "Are you ill?" "Not in the least." "You haven't listened to a word I've been saying. And it was so interesting." He laughed. "What were you thinking of?" "My sins." "Then I don't wonder that you look so badly." But it was clear that she understood him, for after a short silence she spoke of other things. The dinner having progressed to the salad course, visiting was in order, and the guests sauntered from table to table, exchanging chairs and partners. Jane Loring was one of the first to take advantage of this opportunity to escape, and found a seat at Honora Ledyard's table between Bibby Worthington and Percy Endicott. Nellie Pennington watched her departure calmly, for she had learned what she had set out to learn. All women, no matter how youthful, are clever at dissimulation, but the art being common to all women deceives none. And Jane, skillful though she had been in hiding her thoughts from Gallatin, deceived neither Nellie Pennington nor Nina Jaffray. Dinner over, Nellie Pennington followed the crowd to the gun room. The married set were already at their auction, and somebody beckoned to her to make a four, but she refused. On this night she had a mission. She wandered from group to group, keeping one eye on Jane and the other on Phil, until the music began, when with one accord all but the most devoted of the bridge players returned to the hall, from which the furniture had been cleared and where the polished wax surface shone invitingly. Mrs. Pennington waited until the waltz was well under way and saw Jane Loring circling the room safely with Larry Kane, when she went into the library alone. Her thought had crystallized into a definite plan. It was at the end of the third dance, when Jane, on the arm of Percy Endicott, was on her way to the terrace for a breath of air, that Bibby Worthington slipped a note into her fingers. She excused herself and took it to the nearest electric bulb. She knew the handwriting at once. It was in Nina Jaffray's picturesque scrawl. "Jane, dear," it ran, "I must see you for a moment about something which concerns you intimately. Meet me at 12 by the fountain in the loggia of the tennis court. Nina." Jane turned the note over and reread it, then with quick scorn tore it into tiny pieces and scattered them into the bushes. The impudence of her! She had given Nina credit for better taste. What right had she to intrude again in Jane's private affairs when she must know how little her offices were appreciated? And yet, what was this she had to say? Something that concerned Jane intimately? What could that be unless Coleman Van Duyn appeared and claimed the next dance, which he begged that she would sit out. Jane agreed because it would give her a chance to think. There was little real exertion required in talking to Coley. What could Nina want to tell her? And where, did she say? In the loggia of the tennis court at 12. It must be almost that now. At 5 minutes of 12, Nellie Pennington handed Gallatin a note. "From Nina," she whispered. "It's really outrageous, Phil, the way you're flirting with that trusting child. I'm sure you ought to be ashamed of yourself." The tennis court was at the far end of the long house. It was reached by passing first a succession of rooms which made up the main building, into the conservatory, by the swimming pool and loggia. The loggia was a red-tiled portico enclosed in glass during the winter, in the center of which was a fountain surrounded by a circular marble bench, all filched from an old Etruscan villa. Tonight it was unlighted except by the glow from the bronze Japanese lamps in the conservatory, an ideal spot for a tryst, so far removed from the main body of the house, and so cool in winter that it was seldom used except as a promenade or as a haven by those purposely belated. Gallatin, the scrap of paper in his fingers, strolled through the deserted halls, smoking thoughtfully. Nina Jaffray was beginning to grate just a little on his nerves. He had no idea what she wanted of him, and he didn't much care. He only knew that it was almost time for him to make his meaning clear to her in terms which might not be misunderstood. As he entered the obscurity of the loggia, he saw the head and shoulders of a figure in white above the back of the stone bench. "You wanted to see me," he said. At the sound of his voice, the figure rose, stood poised, breathless, and he saw that it was not Nina. "I?" Jane's voice answered. He stopped, and the cigarette slipped from his fingers. I beg pardon. I was told that I wanted to see you?" she broke in scornfully. "No, not you," he replied, still puzzled. "There has been a mistake, Mr. Gallatin. I do not want to see you. If you'll excuse me." She made a move to go, but Gallatin stood in the aperture, the only avenue of escape, and did not move. His hands were at his sides, his head bent forward, his eyes gazing into the pool. "Wait," he muttered as though to himself. "Don't go yet. I've something to say. Just a word. It will not take a moment. Will you listen?" "I suppose I must," she stammered. "I hear," he began painfully, "that it's true that you're going to marry Mr. Van Duyn." "And what if it is?" she flashed at him. "Nothing except that I hope you'll be happy. I wish you—" "Thanks," dryly. "When I'm ready for the good wishes of anybody, I'll ask for them. At present, will you let me pass, please?" "Yes, in a moment. I thought perhaps you might be willing to tell me whether it's true, the report of your engagement." "I can't see how that can be any interest of yours." "Only the interest of one you once cared for and who—" "Mr. Gallatin, I forbid it," she said hurriedly. "Would you be so unmanly as to take advantage of your position here? Isn't it enough that I no longer care to know you, that I prefer to choose my own friends?" "Will you answer my question?" he repeated doggedly. "No, you have no right to question me." "I'm assuming the right. Your memory of the past." "There is no past. It was the dream of a silly child in another world where men were honest and women clean. I've grown older, Mr. Gallatin." "Yes, but not in mercy, not in compassion, not in charity." "Speak of virtue before you speak of mercy, of pride before compassion, of decency before charity, if you can. she added contemptuously. "You're cruel," he muttered. "Horribly so. I'm wiser than I was. The world has done me that service, and if cruelty is the price of wisdom, I'll pay it. Baseness, meanness, improbity in business or in morals no longer surprise me. They're woven into the tissue of life. I can abominate the conditions that cause them, but they are the world, and until I choose to live alone, I must accept them, even if I despise the men and women who practice them, Mr. Gallatin." "And you call this wisdom? This disbelief in everything, in everybody, this threadbare creed of the jaded women of the world? Call it what you like. Neither your opinions nor your principles, or the lack of them, mean anything to me. If I had known you were here, I should not have come tonight. I pray that we may never meet again." He stood silent a long moment, searching her face with his eyes. She was so cold, so white and wraith-like, and her voice was so strange, so impersonal, that he was almost ready to believe that she was someone else. It was the voice of a woman without a soul, a calm, ruthless voice which sought to wound, to injure or destroy. It had been on his lips to speak of the past, to translate into the words the pain at his heart. He had been ready to take one step forward, to seize her in his arms and compel her by the might of his tenderness to return the love that he bore her. If he had done so then, perhaps fortune would have favored him, have favored them both. For in the hour of their greatest intolerance, women are sometimes most vulnerable. But he could not. Her words chilled him to insensibility, scourged his pride, and made him dumb and unyielding. "If that is your wish," he said quietly, "I will do my best to respect it. I'd like you to remember one thing, though, and that is that this meeting was not of my seeking. If I've detained you, it was with the hope that perhaps you might be willing to listen to the truth, to learn what a dreadful mistake you have made, of the horrible wrong you have done." "To you?" "No," sternly. "To Nina Jaffray. Think what you like of me," he went on with sudden passion. "It doesn't matter. You can't make a new pain sharper than the old one. But you've got to do justice to her." "What is the use, Mr. Gallatin?" "It's a lie that they've told, a cruel lie, as you'll learn some day when it will be too late to repair the wrong you've done." "I don't believe that it was a lie, Mr. Gallatin. A lie will not persist against odds. This does. You've done your duty. Now please let me go." "Not yet. You needn't be afraid of me. Let me pass." "In a moment. When you listen. You must. Nina Jaffray is blameless. She would not deny such a story. It would demean her to deny it as it demeans me." "It does demean you," she broke in pitilessly, "as other things have demeaned you. Shame, Mr. Gallatin. Do you think I could believe the word of a man who seeks revenge for a woman's indifference, who, finding her invulnerable, goes to the ends of his resources to attack the members of her family, trying by methods known only to himself and those of his kind to hinder the success of those more diligent than himself, to smirch the good name of an honest man, to obtain money?" "Stop!" cried Gallatin hoarsely, and in spite of herself she obeyed, for he was leaning forward toward her, the long fingers of one hand trembling before him. "You've gone almost too far, Miss Loring," he whispered. "You are talking about things of which you know nothing." "I will not speak of that. nor shall you. For whatever our relations have been or are now, nothing in them justifies that insult. Time will prove the right or the wrong of the matter between Henry K. Loring and me, as time will prove the right and the wrong to his daughter. I ask nothing of her now, nor ever shall, not even a thought. The girl I am thinking of was gentle, kind, sincere. She looked with the eyes of compassion, the far-seeing gaze of innocence unclouded by bitterness or doubt. I gave her all that was best in me, all that was honest, all that was true, and in return she gave me courage, purpose, resolution. I loved her for herself, because she was herself, but more for the things she represented, purity, nobility, strength, which I drew from her like an inspiration. It was to her that I owed the will to conquer myself, the purpose to win back my self-respect. I thanked God for her then, and I'm thankful now, but I'm more thankful that I'm no longer dependent on her. Jane had sunk on the bench again, her head bent, and a sound came from her lips, but he did not hear it. I do not need her now, he went on quietly. What she was is only a memory. What she is, only a regret. I shall live without her. I shall live without any woman, for no woman could ever be to me what that memory is. I love it passionately, reverently, madly, tenderly, and will be true to it, as I have always been. And if ever the moment comes when the woman, that girl, has grown to be, looks into the past, let her remember that love knows not doubt or bitterness, that it lives upon itself, is sufficient unto itself, and that whatever happens is faithful until death. He stopped and stepped aside. I have finished. Miss Loring, now go. The peremptory note startled her, and she straightened and slowly rose. His head was bowed, but his finger pointed toward the door of the conservatory. As she passed him, she hesitated as though about to speak, and then slowly raising her head, walked past him and disappeared. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of The Silent Battle by George Gibbs. Recording by Tony Oliva. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Big business. Tooker fidgeted uneasily with the papers on the junior partner's desk, moving to the safe in the main office and back again, bringing bundles of documents which he disposed in an orderly row where Mr. Gallatin could put his hands on them. 11 o'clock was the hour set for the conference between Henry K. Loring and Philip Gallatin. Mr. Leuppold had written last week that Mr. Loring had agreed to a conference and asked Mr. Gallatin to come to his, Mr. Leuppold's, private office at a given time. Gallatin had agreed to the day and hour named, but politely insisted that Mr. Leuppold and Mr. Loring come to his office. It would have made no difference in the result, of course, but Gallatin had reasons of his own. At 10 o'clock, Philip Gallatin came in and read his mail. He had returned yesterday from his southern visit, and in the afternoon had gone over with Mr. Kenyon and Mr. Hood the details of the case. The matter had been discussed freely, but it was clear to Tooker, who had been present, that the other partners had been able to add nothing but their approval to the work which Gallatin had done. His mail finished, Gallatin took up the other papers on his desk and scrutinized them carefully, after which he glanced at his watch and pressed the button for the chief clerk. "There has been no message from Mr. Leuppold, Tooker?" he asked. "Nothing." Gallatin smiled. "That's good. I was figuring on a slight chance that they might want more time and ask a postponement." "I had thought of that. It wouldn't help them. I guess they've found that out." "I hope so. But I shouldn't take any chances." "No, I won't," he returned grimly. And then, "Mr. Markham is here, isn't he?" "Yes. He came early. I've shown him into Mr. Kenyon's office as you directed." "Very good, Tooker. And I will want you, so please don't go out." "I'm not going out this morning, Mr. Gallatin," said Tooker with a grin. After the chief clerk had disappeared, Gallatin walked to the window, where he stood for a long while with his hands behind his back, looking out toward the Jersey shore. His thoughts were not pleasant ones. The words of Jane's recriminations were still ringing in his ears. It was Henry Loring, of course, who had put all that into her head, but he blamed her for the readiness with which she had been willing to condemn him from the first, the facility with which she had been able to turn from him to another. His idol had passed. He turned into the room, brows lowering and jaws set, and went to his desk again. There, at a few moments past 11, Tooker brought in word that Mr. Leuppold and Mr. Loring were waiting to see him. "Tell them to wait in the outer office, Tooker," he said with a gleam in his eye, "that I will be at liberty in a few moments. I'll ring you." When Tooker had gone, Gallatin sat down again, glanced at his watch, then took up the morning paper, which he had not yet opened, and read, smiling. It amused him to think of Henry K. Loring sitting in the outer office, wasting time worth $100 a minute. It amused him so much that he dropped the paper, put his feet up on his desk, and lit a cigarette to enjoy the situation more thoroughly. Leuppold, too, his suavity slowly yielding to his impatience, would be twisting his watch fob by now, or tapping his fat fingers on his legs while he waited, his ease of mind little improved by the delay. Gallatin's smile diminished with his cigarette, and at last he looked at his watch and put his feet on the floor and rang for the chief clerk. "You may show those gentlemen in, Tooker," he said quietly. Tooker glanced at the ashes of the cigarette, picked up the newspaper and put it on a chair in the corner, then laid one or two documents obtrusively open on Mr. Gallatin's desk. Phil watched him with a smile. Tooker was a thoughtful and cautious soul, but he was reading the nearest document intently when Loring and Leuppold entered. He turned in his chair, rose and bowed. "You've met Mr. Loring, Mr. Gallatin?" said Leuppold. Loring dropped his chin abruptly the fraction of an inch, peering keenly about, his lips drawn in a thin and unpleasant smile. Phil Gallatin indicated a chair at one end of the table, into which Loring stiffly sat, with one arm on the table, his bull neck thrust forward, peering steadily at the younger man, watching every movement, studying his face as though trying by the intentness of his gaze to solve the question as to whether this curiously inconsistent young man was a menace or merely a nuisance. Gallatin laid some papers upon the table, took some others from Tooker, and moved his desk chair to the table. If he felt Loring's scrutiny, his calm demeanor gave no sign of it, for after a few commonplaces he began addressing his remarks directly to Mr. Leuppold's client. "I don't propose to take up a great deal of your time, gentlemen," he began, "and I think I can state my position in a very few moments." He took out his watch and looked at it. "About 20 minutes, I think. The facts, as you both know, are these. John Sanborn, representing the minority stockholders of the Sanborn Mining Company, filed an injunction against the president and board of directors of the Sanborn Mining Company to prevent the sale of its properties and interests to the Pequot Coal Company. This injunction was lost in the Supreme Court and was appealed to the Appellate Court, when the case came into my hands. The appeal is pending. That is a correct statement, is it not?" "It is," said Leuppold blandly, while Loring nodded his head. "The sale has, therefore, not been consummated and cannot be consummated until the higher court has affirmed the decision of the lower one or reversed it." "That is also true, Mr. Gallatin," said Leuppold. "Proceed, sir." Gallatin hesitated. His brows drew together and his voice took a deeper note. "This case, Mr. Leuppold, is one which involves not only large issues but large principles. The Sanborn Mining Company owns the most valuable coal properties, with a possible exception of those owned by the Pequot Coal Company, in the state of Pennsylvania, and until 1909 was doing an enormous business with the trade centers of the East, working at full capacity and employing an army of men in getting its coal to market. Its only rival in production was the Pequot Coal Company, of which Mr. Loring, as he has admitted, controls the majority of the stock. In the summer of 1909 conditions changed. The Lehigh and Pottsville Railroad Company found it impossible to furnish cars to the Sanborn mines. I have copies of the correspondence relating to the matter, repeated letters of request on the part of the Sanborn Company and excuses on the part of the railroad company, as well as frequent promises which were never fulfilled." "What has that to do with the pending suit?" asked Leuppold carelessly, with an effective shrug of his shoulder. "I'm coming to that, Mr. Leuppold, and I ask for your patience," said Gallatin. "This failure of the railroad company to provide facilities for the shipment of the coal of the Sanborn mines," he continued, "is all the more remarkable when it is known that while this very correspondence was going on, its sidings between Phillipsville and Williamstown were full of empty cars, and when it is also known that the Pequot Coal Company was working on full time and shipping to New York City alone 150 cars of coal a day." "We had contracts with the railroad," snapped Loring. "We forced them to provide for us." "So had the Sanborn Company contracts, Mr. Loring," said Gallatin. "Really?" sneered Loring. Tooker quickly abstracted a paper from a sheaf and handed it to Gallatin. "Read for yourself." The sneer on Loring's lips faded, and his eyes opened wider as he read. It was not a copy but the contract itself. "I have also a volume of evidence about the empty cars which verifies my statement. Would you care to look over it?" "No. Go on," growled Loring. "Gentlemen," Gallatin went on, enunciating his words with great distinctness, "this was discrimination of a kind which at this time is not popular with the government of the United States." "But if you'll permit me, Mr. Gallatin," Leuppold's suave voice broke in, "what has this to do with the Sanborn injunction suit? And how can my client be held in any way responsible for the action of the Lehigh and Pottsville Railroad Company for its failure to fulfill its contracts to the Sanborn Company?" Gallatin raised a protesting hand. "I'm coming to that, Mr. Leuppold. In a moment, sir. The conditions I have already mentioned have forced the Sanborn Company practically to shut down. Coal is being mined and a few cars a day are shipped. But, as you gentlemen are well aware, dividends have been passed for 2 years, and the value of the stock has depreciated. This much for the conditions which have caused that depreciation. The Pequot Coal Company, taking advantage of the low market value of the shares, has made an offer for the property, an offer, gentlemen, which, as you both know, represents not 1/20th of the Sanborn Company's holdings." "I can't agree with that," put in Leuppold quickly. "It was a fair offer, accepted by the board of directors of the Sanborn Company, Mr. Sanborn alone dissenting." Gallatin arose and picked up a package wrapped in rubber bands. "I'm ready to talk about that board of directors now, Mr. Leuppold," he said quietly, with his eyes on Loring's face. "And I'm also ready to talk about the board of directors of the Lehigh and Pottsville Railroad Company." Henry K. Loring's expression was immovable, but Mr. Leuppold's fingers were already at his watch fob. "I'm going to lay my hand on the table, gentlemen," Gallatin went on with a quiet laugh. "I'm going to show you all my cards and let them play themselves. I'm going to prove to you so clearly that you can't doubt the accuracy of my information or the character of my evidence, that I am aware that Henry K. Loring has at the present time not only the control of the stock of the Sanborn Mining Company, but that he also controls a voting majority of the stock of the Lehigh and Pottsville Railroad Company." Leuppold laughed outright. "Absurd, sir. Your statement is flattering to my client, but I beg that you will confine your remarks to the bounds of reason." "I will to the bounds of reason, to the bounds of fact. It's no laughing matter, Mr. Leuppold, as you'll discover presently. I will not speak of Mr. Loring's connection with the railroad for a moment. Perhaps, since this conference has been called with especial reference to the injunction suit, the proof of Mr. Loring's majority stock ownership in the Sanborn Company will be sufficient." "You can't prove that without manufactured evidence." Gallatin flushed. "Call it what you like. It's here, in my possession. The majority stock of the Sanborn Mining Company is now owned by Henry K. Loring and has been voted under cover for the benefit of the Pequot Coal Company." "That's a grave charge, Mr. Gallatin." "So grave that I thought it fairer to Mr. Loring to have him learn what I know before bringing the matter into court." "You have proved nothing yet." Gallatin opened some papers and laid them on the table. "I have here an affidavit of a former employee of Mr. Loring, which I propose to offer in evidence." "Who?" growled Loring. "One moment, please. I have also an abstract from the books of the company with entries showing the purchase of stock, the amounts, the price, and the dates of payment." Leuppold leaned forward in his chair. "Even you must know, Mr. Gallatin, that that's not evidence." "I'm well aware of that. But when the time comes, Mr. Leuppold, I intend to call for the production of the original books." Leuppold raised a protesting hand and then said craftily, "Those books are lost, Mr. Gallatin." Gallatin only smiled at him. "Thanks for that information, Mr. Leuppold. For that being the case, even you will admit that my copy is admissible in secondary evidence." Loring's quick glance caught Leuppold's. The point was well taken. Leuppold covered his confusion with a magnificent gesture and a resumption of his blandest manner. "How are you going to prove that these are copies from the books?" he asked easily. "I will produce that evidence at the proper time." "Produce it now." "I will, if necessary." "That is the weakness of your case, Mr. Gallatin. You can't produce it," he sneered. Gallatin turned to the chief clerk and said, "The checks, Tooker." Gallatin removed some slips of paper from the envelope Tooker handed him and held them carelessly in his fingers, so that the two men who were eyeing them eagerly could see the name of the bank and the signature at the lower right-hand corner. "Perhaps Mr. Loring will deny his own signature?" he asked quietly. "These checks I hold are signed with Mr. Loring's name, a signature with which we are all familiar, and were given to Mr. Loring's brokers for the purchase of Sanborn stock. I may add that the date of entry on the books of the company in each case corresponds with the date on the checks, as does the amount." He stepped to Loring's side and held several of the checks up just beyond his reach. "That's not my signature," said Loring. Gallatin handed the checks to Tooker. "You're not convinced?" "No, it's a forgery." "Then I'll find other means of convincing you. Perhaps if I produced a man who saw you sign those checks." Loring had risen to his feet and spoke but one word. It was the popular one for the infernal regions. Gallatin smiled, and then to the chief clerk, "Tooker, show Mr. Markham in, please." The situation had gotten beyond the control of Mr. Leuppold, who was completely nonplussed by Mr. Gallatin's rapidity, succinctness and damnable accuracy. But he made one desperate effort to regain his lost ground. "Markham, a broken man, a drunkard, a gambler." "But once Mr. Loring's secretary," Gallatin broke in significantly. "Wait, Mr. Leuppold." In a moment Mr. Markham entered. He was a tall man with keen eyes, hawk-like nose, and a weak mouth. As he entered, Loring turned toward the door and the eyes of the two men met. Loring's curious, the newcomer's eager and unflinching. "Mr. Markham," asked Gallatin, "do you know this gentleman?" "Yes. He is Henry K. Loring." "Have you ever seen these checks?" "Yes. I drew them and saw Mr. Loring sign them." "And this affidavit?" "I wrote it." "And this abstract of the books of the Sanborn Company?" "I have seen it." "Is it correct?" "In every particular." "All right. That will be all for the present. Will you remain outside?" "Wait, sir." Leuppold's voice rang out. "I haven't finished with Mr. Markham yet." "You'll have the opportunity of questioning him at the proper time and place," said Gallatin smoothly. "That will be all, Mr. Markham." "I protest, Mr. Gallatin, against your methods of conducting this meeting," said Leuppold, rising and extending a quavery arm. "You bring as your chief evidence a man once in the employ of my client, a discredited clerk, a man discharged for drunkenness, for incompetence, for dishonesty." "No, for honesty, Mr. Leuppold," Gallatin broke in hotly. "That was why he was discharged. He was too honest to understand the ethics of big business and his utility was at an end, so Mr. Loring let him go. That was a mistake. He knew too much, Mr. Leuppold." "You'll have a chance to prove what he knows, sir. There won't be much difficulty in discrediting his testimony." "You're making a mistake, Mr. Leuppold," broke in Gallatin, his voice now thundering. "The question here isn't so much one of law as it is one of morals. That injunction may be dissolved by the Court of Appeals, but I give you my word that if you insist on carrying through that sale of the Sanborn mines to the Pequot Coal Company, I propose to charge your client and the directors of the Sanborn Company with conspiracy. And I'll convict them just as sure as the Lord made little apples." He dominated the situation and felt it in the short hush that followed his concluding remarks, and in the rapid revolution of Leuppold's watch charm. Loring had sunk back in his chair, both of his great hands clasping its arms, his gaze on Gallatin's face, critical but smiling. What he saw there evidently brought a realization that Mr. Gallatin held the whip hand, for as Leuppold began speaking again, he moved one of his hands through the air and rose. "Wait," he said. He took 2 or 3 paces across the room between window and door and then stood, his hands in his trousers pockets, fumbling at his keys. It was at least 5 minutes before he spoke again, but at last he stopped in front of Gallatin and looked at him from head to toe, and suddenly, to everyone's surprise, broke out into a loud laugh. "Mr. Gallatin, you've beaten me." Success had come so quickly and the end of the case so suddenly that Gallatin looked at his adversary, not certain whether to believe his own ears, and half suspecting some kind of a ruse or trick, the art of which Henry K. Loring, as he knew, was past grand master, when he went on again. "I don't propose to ask you how you found Mr. Markham out in Illinois, or to try to learn what your methods were in getting together all this evidence. I know it's there, and that's enough. I did write those checks, and the abstracts from the books are doubtless correct. I suppose," he laughed again, "your evidence of my connection with the Lehigh and Pottsville is quite tangible?" "Quite tangible," repeated Gallatin, scarcely concealing a smile. "Then all I have to say, sir, is that you are a very extraordinary young man, a very useful young man to your clients, a very disappointing one to your adversaries." And then turning to Leuppold, "You may contest if you like, Mr. Leuppold. I won't. This case is one for settlement." Then he turned to Gallatin again and offered his huge hand, while the younger man, still doubtful, eyed him keenly. "You and I had words some time ago. I'm sorry for them. Will you forgive me?" There was no doubt about the genuineness of his contrition. "Willingly, Mr. Loring," he said. Their fingers clasped and their eyes met. "I underestimated you, Mr. Gallatin," he went on again slowly. "I don't often make a mistake in my judgment of men, but I did of you. I'm a self-made man, and people will tell you I'm a little proud of the job. But I'm not too proud to tell you that you've been a little too clever for me. I know when I'm beaten, and I'm not afraid to say so. We'll fix this thing up. I don't want all the coal in Pennsylvania. I own 60% of the Sanborn stock. Sanborn's crowd owns the rest. I'll sell out 20% to some man agreed on, and we'll make him president." "At the present market figure, Mr. Loring?" asked Gallatin shrewdly. Loring rubbed his head and smiled. "We'll see about that," he muttered at last, but there was a twinkle in his eyes as he asked, "How would you like that job, Mr. Gallatin?" Gallatin grinned. "I take it if I could get enough cars to make it profitable." "I reckon you can make it profitable enough for everybody," he growled jovially. "We've got to have you in with us, and that's all there is about it. Will you accept?" "With Sanborn's consent, yes." "We'll fix Sanborn all right," he finished. "Come to my office sometime, Mr. Gallatin. I want to talk to you." Gallatin followed the two men to the elevator while Tooker, after the door was closed, moved from one leg to the other in what he fondly believed to be a dance of joy. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of The Silent Battle by George Gibbs. Recording by Tony Oliva. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Mr. Loring reflects. Henry K. Loring sat back in his machine, homeward bound, his head deep in the collar of his overcoat, his eyes under their shaggy brows peering out of the windows of the limousine. His heavy hands, one over the other, grasped the handle of his cane, which stood upright between his firmly planted feet. He looked out of the windows at the quickly changing scene, but his eyes saw nothing. There was a frown at his brow. His lips were drawn firmly together, and a casual glance might have lent to the belief that the great operator was weighted with a more than usually heavy financial burden. But a closer inspection would have shown a slight upward twist of his lips and scarcely perceptible puckering of the wrinkles at the corners of his eyes. For a man whose business affairs had on that day been subjected to the searching inquisition that Mr. Gallatin had put them to, he seemed to be taking life rather good-naturedly. To tell the truth, he was thinking of the futile efforts of the elder Leuppold in trying to stem the tide which had set so strongly against him. He had gone over Mr. Gallatin's evidence at the conference point by point, and the hours had only confirmed him in the realization that this young man, whom he had scorned, had given the oily and ingenious Leuppold a very unpleasant morning, for wriggle as Leuppold might, there had been no escaping the young man's clear-headed statements and the dangerous nature of his evidence. Henry K. Loring was a good fighter, a shrewd judge of men, and the thing that most bothered him at the present moment was not that he had been obliged to compromise the Sanborn case, but that he should have been so mistaken in the character and abilities of Philip Gallatin. He couldn't understand it at all, and it hurt his pride in his own judgment. Was this sharp young man with the lean face, the keen eye, and the quick, incisive tones of confidence in himself, was this brilliant, hard-working young lawyer who had been clever enough to outwit Henry Loring at his own game, was this Phil Gallatin, the club loafer, at whose name men had wagged their heads or shrugged their shoulders in pity or contempt? It didn't seem possible. There was a mistake somewhere. Was this the young man who... He sat straight up suddenly as the thought came to him. By George, this was Jane's young man, the fellow who had found Jane up in the woods, who had followed her around and made love to her. The fellow Jane had been in love with until he, Loring, had opened her eyes and packed him out of the house about his business. That was too bad. Loring was sorry about that now. He had done Gallatin an injustice. Curious that he should have made such a mistake. He would have to rectify it somehow with Jane. What was the trouble? Oh, yes, a woman. That was what had turned Jane against him. A woman. Well, it wasn't the first time a man had been led off by a woman. What of it? The Gallatin with whom he had recently become acquainted wasn't the kind of a fellow who would let any woman get the best of him. That was his own affair anyway. He, Loring, would have to talk to Jane. Gallatin was all right. He had quit drinking, too, the younger Leuppold had said. Any young fellow who could work up a case like that under cover and drive a man like Henry K. Loring to the wall was good enough for him. That was the kind of a man he wanted for Jane. Just the kind of man to take up the game where he would leave it and hold the great Loring interests together. What did Jane want, anyhow? She had loved Phil Gallatin once. Her mother had told him so. And now she had settled on Coleman Van Duyn. Hell! He got down at his own door with a sudden resolve to find out just how things stood with Jane and Coley Van Duyn. Mrs. Loring had wanted that match. It wasn't any of Loring's choosing. She had wanted an old Dutch ancestry. She'd be getting it with Coley, and that was about all she would get. Jane had been expected back with the Ledyards from Virginia this morning. Perhaps it wasn't too late for her father to step into the breach and repair the damage he had done. In reply to his question of the man in the hall, he learned that Miss Loring had returned from the South during the morning, but that she had been in her room all day. Henry K. Loring climbed the marble stairs and went along the landing to Mrs. Loring's room. He found her lying on the divan, a handkerchief crumpled in her hands, her face stained with tears. A look of resignation that was half a frown came into Loring's face. Like many another man, big in his walks abroad, he lost some stature in the presence of a tearful wife. At his entrance she straightened and said irritably, "I thought you were never coming." "I was detained." He looked at his watch. "Aren't you going to dress?" "No, I'm going to have my dinner brought up." "What's the matter?" "Oh, what isn't the matter? Jane, of course." "Jane?" "I can't make her out at all. She came back from Warrenton this morning and went immediately to her room. I went in this afternoon again. She was looking miserably unhappy, and when I began talking to her, she burst into tears." "Nerves?" he queried. "Oh, I don't know. She hasn't been herself for some time. She's looking very badly." "Yes, I noticed that. What do you think the trouble is?" Mrs. Loring sank back with a sigh. "Oh, I don't know. I never did understand Jane, and I don't suppose I ever shall. She says she isn't going to anything this spring, that she wants to go abroad, away from everybody. And finally, when I pressed her, she told me that she had given Coleman Van Duyn his congé. Think of it!" The poor lady rattled on while Loring turned his back and walked the length of the room to hide a smile which grew suddenly at his lips. When she had finished speaking, he returned and questioned again. "Why did she change her mind? Do you know?" "I don't think she has changed her mind. I don't believe that she has ever cared for Mr. Van Duyn. It was all a mask to hide her real feelings. I'm sure she still loves that worthless Gallatin." Loring's eyebrows lifted, his gaze roved, and his lips were quickly compressed. Then his brows tangled. "What makes you think that?" he asked. "Everything makes me think it. Everything. from the manner in which she first confessed her love for him to me, to the curious way she has been treating Mr. Van Duyn. He spoke about the matter only last week. Poor fellow. He's beginning to look very badly. Jane hasn't treated him fairly." "That depends. They were never engaged." Mrs. Loring raised herself on one elbow, her eyes searching her husband's face in surprise. "There was an understanding." "Between you and Van Duyn. Jane never consented." "Henry, I don't understand you. You've let this thing go on without speaking. You approved."
"No, I didn't approve," he said quickly. "I merely acquiesced."
Mrs. Loring showed signs of inward agitation. "Oh, I give her up. I've done the best I could. She has behaved very badly and I don't know what to think of her." She began sobbing into her handkerchief and renewed her familiar plaint. "I do the best I can for her, for you, but you're always going against me, both of you. I've tried so hard this winter, kept going when my nerves were on the ragged edge of collapse, just because I thought it was my duty."
There, mother, don't be foolish," said Loring soothingly. "Jane is young, too young to marry anyway. She'll decide some day."
"No, I know her. She makes up her mind to a thing and she'll cling to it until death. She's like you in that way. She would rather die than change. I ought to have realized that. If she can't marry Phil Gallatin, she won't marry anyone. Phil Gallatin!" she cried. "The least desirable young man in New York, a man without character, without friends, the last of a tainted stock, a fortune hunter, dissolute."
He let her go on until she had exhausted both her adjectives and her nerves, while he listened thoughtfully and then asked, "You're sure she still loves Mr. Gallatin?"
"I've tried to believe that she would forget him, that she would learn to care for Mr. Van Duyn, but she hasn't. She has never been the same girl since you told her about that dreadful Jaffray woman. I'm afraid she'll be sick, really sick. But I can't do anything. What can I do?"
The poor lady looked up plaintively, but her husband had walked to the window and was looking out into the avenue. "Humph," he grunted. "Lovesick, eh? There ought to be a cure for that."
"What?"
"Let her marry him."
"Henry!"
Mrs. Loring sat bolt upright on her couch, her eyes wide with incomprehension.
"What do you mean?"
"What I say," he returned calmly.
"That Jane should marry Phil Gallatin?"
He nodded.
"You're mad,"
she said, getting up and facing him.
"Stark mad. When you learned about them, you told me you'd rather see her dead than married to him."
"Now, I'd rather see her married to him than dead. It's simple enough. I've changed my mind."
"Am I taking leave of my senses, or are you?"
"Neither, mother." He went over to her, his huge frame towering above her small body as his mind towered over hers, and took her gently by the elbows. "I've made a mistake. So have you. But it's not too late to mend it. I say that if Jane wants Phil Gallatin, she shall have him."
"No, no. What has happened, Henry?"
"I've opened my eyes, that's all. Or rather, Gallatin has opened them for me. I'm glad he did. And now I'm going to open yours. Phil Gallatin is a full-sized man. I found that out today. A man, every inch of one. I don't care about his past. I wasn't anything to brag about when I was a kid, and you know that, too. I didn't amount to a hill of beans until my father died, and I went up against it good and hard. I was down to bedrock as Phil Gallatin was, until I got kicked once too often, And then I learned to kick back, and I've been kicking back ever since. I don't care about Phil Gallatin's past. That belongs to him. The only thing that matters about the man Jane marries is his future. That's hers." Loring put his hands in his pockets and walked up and down the rug, his bulk, physical and mental, dominating Mrs. Loring's tears. "Listen to me. I've let you go on with your plans for Jane, and I haven't said anything because I knew that when the time came for Jane to marry, your plans wouldn't amount to much and mine wouldn't either. Oh, I've been looking on. I've been watching this Van Duyn affair. I never thought Jane would ever marry a nonentity like Van Duyn. If I had thought so, I guess I might have worried. But I didn't worry because I never thought she did want to marry him. It seems I was right." He chuckled. He waited a moment as though expecting an interruption from his wife, but she made none, and only sat in hopeless uncertainty, listening dumbly. "For all her inexperience, Jane has an old head, Mother. This splendor we're living in, her success in society, the flattery and compliments haven't changed her any, and she's not going to let anybody make a fool of her. She sees through people better than you do, and she doesn't make many mistakes. I ought to have known she wouldn't have fallen in love with Phil Gallatin if there hadn't been something to him. I'll give her credit for that."
"What makes you think he's worthy of her?" Mrs. Loring broke in. "You talk of his future. What future can there be for a man with a habit?"
"Wait," he commanded. "As to that, he's quit. Do you understand? Quit it altogether. I'm just as sure of that as I am that Jane's judgment was better than mine. So sure that I'm willing to stake Jane's future on it. You needn't ask me why I know it, but I do. He's made good with me, and he's made good with himself." And while she listened, he told her of the events of the morning which had resulted in the failure of his financial project, and of Gallatin's share in it. "And is this a reason? You're willing to forgive him his sins, his evil reputation, and take him into your house as the husband of your only child, because he stands in the way of your making a lot of money? I don't understand." "There's a lot you don't understand. You and I don't use the same kind of mental machinery. But I want you to know that any boy of his age who's got the nerve to tackle a big game the way he did that one, and went out against a man of my caliber, is the kind of a young man I want on my side. He's the kind of a young man I've been looking for ever since I went into the coal business, and I'm not going to let him go if I can help it."
"But his morals. You must know what people say about him, that he's—"
"I don't care what they say about him," growled Loring. "Half of the world is lying and the other half listening. I'm glad he isn't a Willie boy. It's the fellow who has to fight temptations that learns the meaning of victory. There are no air holes in the steel that's been through the blast, and that boy has been through the blast. I can read it in his face. He couldn't square up to me the way he did if there was any weakness in him. He's suffered, but it hasn't hurt him any. He's found himself. I'm going to help him. See here, Janet, I'm getting older and so are you. I've been thinking about it some lately. I'm a pretty rich man and I'm going to be richer. But do you think I want to turn the money I leave over to a man like Coley Van Duyn or Durwell Delancey to make ducks and drakes of? Have it turned into an amusement fund for the further debauching of debauched gentility, make a trust fund of it to perpetuate the pink tea? I reckon not. I haven't worked all these years for nothing, and I'm going to see that Jane doesn't make the mistakes of other rich men's children. I don't think she wants to anyway. I've always told her that she wouldn't find the man she's going to marry walking up and down Fifth Avenue. The man to keep my estate together has got to be made of different stuff. I've found him. He's an ace that I dropped into the discard by mistake, but I'm going to play him just the same. I want him, and if Jane wants him too, I'm going to get him for her. I don't know what to think of you. I can't see yet," Mrs. Loring wailed. Loring stopped beside her and patted her on the shoulder. "Don't you worry, Janet. I know what I'm about. You leave this to me. Is Jane in her room? I want to see her." "Yes," said Mrs. Loring in tones of resignation. "She's there, but I don't think she'll see you, even if she knew what you wanted to talk about. Tomorrow, perhaps." Loring shrugged his massive shoulders. "Oh, all right," he growled, and made his way to his own dressing room. He held the keys to the situation in his hand, and manlike wanted to use them without delay, to unlock the door that barred the way to happiness for Jane, to act at once upon the inspiration that had come to him and settle for all time the problem of the future. But he took his wife's advice and postponed the talk with his daughter, wondering at the ways of women. He dined alone and went to his study early, sat at his desk and wrote the following note to Philip Gallatin. "Dear Mr. Gallatin, our meeting this morning was so brief and so public that I was prevented from speaking to you as freely as I would have liked. I've done you a wrong, an injustice, and I want to do what I can to set the matter right, with respect to your future relations with me and with my family. I have already done what I can, and I am sure that both Mrs. Loring and my daughter will gladly welcome you as a guest to our house whenever you may call. I hope this will be soon, Mr. Gallatin. I only wanted to put myself on record with you that you may be assured that there will be no further misunderstandings on your part of our intentions toward you. Very sincerely yours, Henry K. Loring." The note written, he sealed it and rang for Hastings. "Have this note delivered at once. Try the Cosmos Club, and if Mr. Gallatin is not there, find him." This burden off his broad shoulders, Loring smiled, turned on his reading lamp, took some newly acquired snuff boxes out of a cabinet, and under his magnifying glass proceeded to enjoy them. It was in the midst of this pleasant occupation that some time later he was interrupted by the entrance of his daughter. She was dressed in a pale blue lounging robe, and her bedroom slippers made no sound on the heavy floor covering, but the rustle of her draperies caused him to look up. "Hello, Jane," he said, kissing her. "Glad to see you, child. You slipped in like a ghost. Feeling any better?" "Oh, I'm all right," she said wearily. "Mother said you wanted to see me." Loring put down his magnifying glass and turned toward her. "Yes, I did. Natural, isn't it? I haven't had a chance to for a month." He made her turn so that he could look into her face. "You're not looking right. Your eyes are big as saucers. What's the matter? Too much gaiety?"
Yes, I think so, Daddy. I'm a little tired, that's all. I need a rest." Her father examined her in silence for a moment and then drew her down on a chair near him. "Jane, I've been thinking about you lately. We've all been so busy this winter, you and Mother with your dances and the opera, and I with business, that I'm afraid we've been drifting apart. I don't like it. You don't ever come in here to see me the way you used to." "I haven't had time," she evaded. "That isn't it, daughter. I know. It's something else. Something has come between us. I've felt it and I feel it still." She opened her eyes wide and looked at him and then looked away. "That's the truth, and you know it, daughter. Something has come between us. I've missed those talks with you. They used to keep me in touch with the gentler side of life. Sort of humanized me somehow, made me a little softer, a little gentler the next day. I've wanted you often, Jane, but I didn't know how to say so, and so I got along without you. You've never quite forgiven me, Jane." Jane was pulling at the laces of her tea gown with thumb and forefinger, but she didn't look up as she asked, "Forgiven you for what, Daddy?" "For coming between you and Phil Gallatin," he said gently. She started a trifle and then went on picking at the lace on her frock. "Oh, that," she said quietly. "You had to do that. I'm glad you did." "No," he interrupted. "You're not glad, Jane. Neither am I. I did what I thought was my duty, but it has made a difference with us both. I'm sorry." "Sorry? Why?" "Because it has made you unhappy and resentful." "I'm not resentful." "Yes, I've felt it. Even if I'd been justified, you would still resent it." "But you were justified, Daddy, weren't you?" she asked. She turned her gaze full on his face and the pain in her eyes hurt him. He got up and walked the length of the room before he replied. "I did what I thought was right. I'd probably do the same thing again under similar circumstances. I didn't think Mr. Gallatin the kind of man I wanted for you." She lay back in her chair and looked into the fire, but said nothing. Loring came close to her and laid his hand on her shoulder. "You loved him, Jane?" She didn't reply. "You still love him, daughter?" Her head moved slowly from side to side. "No," she muttered stiflingly. "No, no." Loring smiled down at the top of her head. "Why should you deny it, Jane? What would you say if I acknowledged that I had made a mistake in judgment, that you were right after all, that Phil Gallatin is not the man I thought him, that he's worthy in every way of your regard, that of all the young men I've met in New York in business or out of it, he is the one man I would rather have marry my daughter?" She had risen and was leaning toward him, pale and trembling. "What do you mean?" she whispered fearfully. He told her. "That case you spoke of?" "He beat me fairly. He beat me badly, so badly that I can't afford to have him against me. I've taken him into the business. I can't afford to be without him." "Then what you said about him?" "I was fooled, child, completely fooled. We thought he was a joke. We laughed at him, and all the while he was out West, working quietly, skillfully, diligently piling up his evidence. He's made good, Jane, and I've told him so.
I've written him a note tonight, a note of apology for my share in his unhappiness, telling him that I was sorry for what had happened and telling him that he would be a welcome visitor to my house." "Daddy!" Jane had straightened and now glanced fearfully toward the door as though she expected to see Phil Gallatin at any moment coming through the curtains. "You had no right to do that. I will not see him. Whatever his business relations with you, you have no right to force him on me. I have known for a long time that he was clever, that he could make his way in the world if he wanted to. But your acceptance of him changes nothing with me." "But you love him," he persisted. "No, no," she protested. "I could never love a man who had once been faithless. Never forgive him, never even in death. That a man is successful in the world is all you men care about. Oh, I know you. Because he's matched his brain against yours and beaten you, you think he's a demigod. But that doesn't change the heart in him, the lips that swear love eternal while they're kissing another." "Lies," broke in Loring with a wave of his hand. "I don't believe that story." Jane paused and examined him calmly, struggling for her control. When she spoke, her voice had sunk to a trembling note, scarcely above a whisper. "Can you prove that story was a lie?" "Prove it? No. But I believe it was." "You didn't believe so once. Have you heard anything to make you change your opinion?" she insisted. He was tempted to lie, but thought better of it, and his hesitation cost him victory. Jane turned toward the door. "I'm going away somewhere, abroad, if you'll let me, away from here. I will not see Mr. Gallatin ever. I despise him utterly." She left her father standing in the middle of the room, his mouth agape and eyes staring at the door through which she had disappeared. Keen as he was, there were still some things in the world, he discovered, about which he needed information. The next day Mr. Loring received a polite note from Mr. Gallatin, which still further mystified him. Mr. Gallatin thanked him for his kind expressions of good will and expressed the intention of studying further to deserve them, but hoped that Mr. Loring would comprehend that reasons which it were better not to mention would make it impossible for him to take advantage of Mr. Loring's personal kindness in his cordial invitation. Henry Loring was on the point of tearing up the note in disgust, but thought better of it. Instead, with a subtlety which showed that he had not yet lost the knack of taking advantage of the lesser lessons of life, he left it obtrusively upon the dressing table in Mrs. Loring's boudoir, where later, in her mother's absence, Jane found it. End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of The Silent Battle by George Gibbs. Recording by Tony Oliva. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Lodestar. April dissolved in mist and rain, and the flowers of May were blossoming. Nellie Pennington, who had not yet despaired, and Nina Jaffray, who had, were driving in the park in Mrs. Pennington's Victoria. For 2 months, Mrs. Pennington had been paying Nina more than usual attention. To begin with, she liked her immensely, as she had always done. Nina's faults, she believed, to be the inevitable result of her education and environment. For Nina was the daughter of a trust, and was its only indulgence. The habit of getting what she wanted was in her blood, and she simply couldn't understand being balked in anything.
But Nina was beginning slowly and with some difficulty to grasp the essentials of Philip Gallatin's character and the permanence of his reconstruction, and with the passage of time and event Nina had a glimmering of the true caliber of his mind. All of which brought out with unflattering definiteness her own frivolity and gave a touch of farce comedy with which she had in her heart been far from investing it, to her unconventional wooing. Nellie Pennington understood her and noted with no little satisfaction the evidence of the chastening of her spirit. She knew now beyond all doubt that had it not been for Nina, the reconciliation of Jane and Phil Gallatin would have been effected. She knew, too, that Nina had not played fair, and guessed by what means Jane had been victimized. Indeed, Jane's indifference to Nina bore all tokens of intolerance, the intolerance of the pure for the contaminated, the contemptuous pity of the innocent for the guilty. But Mrs. Pennington had not lived in vain, and a talent for living her own life according to an accepted code had given her a kindly insight into the lives of others. Whatever Nina's faults, she had never merited Jane's pity or contempt. Jane was a fool, of course, but so was Nina, each in her own way a fool. But of the two it now seemed that Nina was the lesser. Nellie Pennington had already noticed signs that Nina was tired of the game, and knew that if Larry Kane played his own trumps with care, he might still win the odd trick, which was Nina. But as far as Jane was concerned, Nellie also knew that Nina was ready to die at her guns, for a dislike once born in Nina's breast was not speedily dispelled. Mrs. Pennington looked up at the obelisk as though in the hope that some of the wisdom of its centuries might suddenly be imparted to her. Then she asked, "Nina, why don't you marry Larry Kane?" Nina Jaffray smiled. "And confess defeat. Why? Better confess it now than later. Why confess it at all? You'll have to some day. You're not going to marry Phil, you know." "No, I'm not going to marry Phil. I know that now. I haven't proposed to him for at least a month, and then he was quite impolite, rude, in fact." She sighed. "Oh, I don't care, but I don't want Jane Loring to marry him. She's not likely to. She's as hopelessly stubborn as you are." Nellie Pennington waited a moment, and then with a laugh, "Nina, you've enjoyed yourself immensely, haven't you? Jane is such an innocent. I'd give worlds to know what you said to her." Nina laughed. "Would you?" "Yes, do tell me." "I will. It's very amusing. She expected me to lie, of course, so I simply told her the truth." "And she believed?" "The opposite, of course." Nellie Pennington laughed up at the passing treetops. "How clever of you, Nina. You're wasting your time single. A girl of your talents needs an atmosphere in which to display them." "And you suggest matrimony," said Nina scornfully. "There's always your husband, you know." "But Larry isn't an atmosphere. He's too tangible." "All men are. It's their chief charm." I've never thought so. I shouldn't have wanted to marry Phil if he had been tangible." "Then suppose he had accepted you?" Nina shrugged and crossed her knees. "I should probably have hated him cordially." The conversation changed, then lagged, and by the time Nina's home was reached both women were silent. Nina because she was bored, Nellie because she was thinking. "Good-bye, dear," laughed Nina as she got down at her door. Don't be surprised at anything you hear. I'm quite desperate, so desperate that I may even take your advice. You'll see me off at the pier, won't you?" Nellie Pennington nodded. She was quite sure that it was better for everybody that Miss Jaffray should be upon the other side of the water. The week following, quite by chance, she met Henry K. Loring one afternoon in the gallery at the Metropolitan, where the ceramics were. An emissary from the office was opening the cases for him, and with rare delight he was examining their contents with a pocket glass. She watched him for a while, and when the great man relinquished the last piece of Lang Yao sang de boeuf, the case was closed and locked. She intercepted him and led him off to a bench in a quiet corner, where she laid before him the result of a week of deliberation. He had begun by being bored, for there was a case of the tea dust glazes which he had still planned to look over. But in a moment he had warmed to her proposals and was discussing them with animation. Yes, he had already planned to go to the Canadian woods again this summer. Mrs. Loring wanted to go abroad this year. Mrs. Loring didn't like the woods unless he rented a permanent camp, the kind of place that he and Jane despised. The plan had been discussed and Jane had expressed a willingness to go, but at Mrs. Loring's opposition the matter had been dropped. But Loring had not given up the idea. It would do Jane a lot of good, he admitted. Mrs. Pennington's was a great plan, a brave plan, a beautiful plan, one that did credit to her sympathies and one that must in the end be successful. He would manage it. He would take the matter up at once and arrange for the same guides and outfit he had had last year. Would Mr. and Mrs. Pennington come as his guests? Of course. Who else? Mr. Worthington and Colonel Broadhurst? But could Mr. Kenyon be relied upon to do his share? Very well. He would leave that to Mrs. Pennington. The next afternoon, at Mrs. Pennington's request, John Kenyon called at her house in Stuyvesant Square, and his share in the arrangement was explained to him. He was willing to do anything for Phil Gallatin's happiness that he could, of course, but it amused him to learn how the agreeable lady had taken that willingness for granted, and how she waved aside the difficulties which, as Kenyon suggested, might be encountered. Phil might have other plans. He could be obstinate at times. It might not be easy, either, to get Phil's old guide for the pilgrimage. He needed a rest himself and would go with Phil himself, if by doing so he could be of any assistance. It was now the first week in May. He would see Phil and report in a few days. It was the next morning at the office when Kenyon broached the matter to his young partner. He was surprised that Phil fell in with the plan at once. "Funny," said Phil. "I was thinking of that yesterday. I am tired. The woods would do me a lot of good, but do you think that Hood can get along without us until August?" "We'll manage in some way. You deserve a rest." "And I'm going to take one whether I deserve it or not. Could you get that guide you had last year? What's his name? Joe?" "Keegón. I could try. We need two, but Joe can get another man. I have the address. I'll write today." Gallatin got up and walked across the room to the door, where he stopped. "I suppose I can fix matters with Mr. Loring." "Yes, I think so," replied Kenyon guardedly. "But you'd better be sure of it. He's coming here tomorrow, isn't he?" Gallatin nodded gravely and then thoughtfully went out. That night John Kenyon dutifully reported in Stuyvesant Square. Mr. Loring also dutifully reported there, and the three persons completed the details of the conspiracy. So it happened that toward the middle of June, Phil Gallatin and John Kenyon reached the jumping off place in the Canadian wilds. No two jumping off places are alike, but this one consisted of 3 or 4 frame dwellings and a store, all squatted on the high bank of a small river, which came crystal clear from the mystery of the deep woods above. John Kenyon got down from the stage that had driven them the 10 miles from the nearest railroad station, and stood on the plank walk in front of the store, a touch of color in his yellow cheeks, sniffing eagerly at the smell of the pine balsam. Gallatin glanced around at the familiar scene. Nothing was changed. The canoes drawn up along the bank, the black setter dog, the Indian packers lounging in the shade, the smell of their black tobacco, the cool welcome of the trader who came out of the store to greet them. Joe Keegón and another Indian whose name turned out to be Charlie Knapp got the valises out of the wagon. Gallatin offered Joe his hand, and the Indian took it with the steady-eyed taciturnity of the wilderness people. Joe was no waster of words or of emotion. He led the way into the store of the trader, and they went over the outfit together. Blankets, ammunition, tea, pork, flour, tents, and all the rest of it, while John Kenyon sat on a flour barrel, swinging his legs, smoking a corncob pipe and listening. That night, after Phil had turned in, he sent a letter and a telegram to a Canadian address and gave them to the teamster with some money. Then he too went to bed, dreaming of Arcadia. They had been in the woods for 3 weeks now. They weren't traveling as light as Phil had done the year before, and the outfit included 2 canoes, well loaded. So they went slowly northward by easy stages, fishing the small streams and camping early. Gallatin had at first been in some doubt as to his partner's physical fitness for severe work, but he soon found that he need have given himself no concern, for with every day a year seemed to be slipping away from John Kenyon, who insisted on taking his share of the burdens with a will that set Phil Gallatin's mind at rest. And as they went farther into the wilderness, they made almost camp for camp, the ones that Phil had made the year before. John Kenyon had hoped that Phil would take him into the Kawagama country. He wanted very much to see that waterfall on the South Fork of the Birch River that Phil had spoken of. Kenyon had an eye for the beautiful. For some time he had been wondering what course of action he would take if Phil refused to fall in with his plans, and had already begun to think that it was time to take Joe into his confidence. But he soon found that subterfuge was unnecessary, for Gallatin was directing their course with an unerring definiteness to his own farthest camp among the hills. John Kenyon guessed something of what was passing in the mind of the younger man, and over the campfire watched him furtively. The sun and wind had tanned him, and the vigorous exercise had brought an appetite that had filled the hollows of his cheeks. But in spite of the glow of health and youth, and the delight of their old friendship, a shadow still hung in Phil Gallatin's eyes, which even the joy of the present could not dispel. Kenyon smoked quietly and asked subtle questions about their further pilgrimage. "Tomorrow we'll reach the permanent camp, Joe?" said Gallatin. Keegón nodded. "We'll stay there for a while, fish and explore." As the time approached for his dénouement, Kenyon had a guilty sense of intrusion. which tempered his delight in the possible success of the venture. But he remembered that he had had little to do in shaping the course of events or the direction of their voyage, except to modify the speed of their journeys so that Phil might reach the spot intended at the appointed time. Phil seemed drawn forward as though by a lodestar to his destination, as though some force greater than his own will was impelling him. Kenyon had taken pains to keep a record by the calendar. It was the 28th of June. The next day Kenyon changed places with Phil and went in Joe's canoe, when he took the old Indian into his confidence. "We will camp tonight. Tomorrow Phil will want to go fishing alone. You must keep him in camp until the next day. Then you must go with him in the morning and lead him to the camp in the hills where the deer was killed. Comprenez?" Joe had learned to understand this grave, quiet man from the city who did his share of the work and who never complained, and he recognized by its contrast to this docility and willingness the sudden voice of authority. He nodded. "All right," he said with a nod. "I take him." Joe's loquacity was flattering. It was the first time on their pilgrimage that Kenyon had heard Joe utter more than one word at a time. The woods had seemed so vast, so interminable, that Kenyon had often wondered whether it would be possible to find a spot so lacking in identity as the one they were seeking. But Joe's nod and smile completely reassured him. In his unfamiliarity with the wilderness he had forgotten that here was Joe Keegan's city, its trails, portages and streams as clearly mapped in his mind as the streets of John Kenyon's New York. The Indian would find the place where the deer was killed. Kenyon breathed a sigh of relief. The wheel of destiny was spinning now, and Kenyon had nothing to do but sit and watch. He had done his share. That night there was much to do, but Keegan seemed in no hurry. When Gallatin, who seemed tireless, was for making a permanent camp at once, Joe shook his head and went on cleaning fish. "Tomorrow," he said. When the morrow came, Gallatin was off in the underbrush hunting firewood before the others were awake. From his place by the fire Joe watched him lazily. "Aren't you going to get to work, Joe?" "Soon," the Indian grunted, but made no movement to get up. "I want to fish." "Tomorrow." "Why not today?" "Make camp." "It won't take all day to make camp." "Rest," said Joe. And that was all that Gallatin could get out of him, so he said no more. For he knew by experience that when Joe's mind had decided a question of policy, mere words made no impression on him. John Kenyon listened from the flap of the tent, with a sleepy eye on the rising sun. "Don't try to combat the forces of nature, my son," he laughed. "Joe's right. I, for one, am going to take things easy." And he rolled himself in his blanket, sank back on his balsam couch and closed his eyes again. There was nothing for Phil but to bow to the inevitable. That day he worked harder even than the guides, and it seemed to John Kenyon that some inward force was driving him at the top of his bent. He spoke little, laughed not at all, and late in the afternoon went off upstream alone with his rod and creel, returning later gloomy and morose. "No fish," said Joe, looking at the empty creel. "Fish tomorrow." Joe actually smiled, and Gallatin laughed in spite of himself. "Big fish tomorrow," repeated Joe. "I show him." The next day Kenyon stayed in camp with Charlie Knapp and watched Phil's departure upstream. Joe had full instructions, and as he followed Gallatin's broad shoulders into the brush, He turned toward the fire and nodded to Kenyon. There was a pact between them and Kenyon understood. The sun was high before Joe left the stream and cut into the underbrush. His employer hadn't even taken his rod from its case, and his creel was empty. Early in the morning he had asked his guide to take him to the little stream where the deer was killed, and he followed the swift, noiseless steps of the old Indian, his shoulders bent, his eyes peering through the thicket in search of landmarks. It was midday before the two men reached the familiar water, and Phil identified the two boulders above his old camping place. Here Keegón halted, eyeing the pool below. "Fish," said he. Gallatin fingered at the fastenings of his rod case, looking downstream, while Joe sat on a rock and munched a biscuit. "I'm going downstream, Joe. You follow." The Indian nodded, and Gallatin moved down among the rocks in the bed of the stream. Pools invited him, but he did not fish. He had not even jointed his rod. He was moving rapidly now, like a man with a mission with which fishing had nothing in common, splashing through the shallow water, jumping from rock to rock, or where the going was good, along the shore, through the underbrush. There was a trail to follow now, a faint trail scarcely defined, but in which he saw the faint marks of last year's footprints. His own they must be, heavy from the weight of the deer he had carried through the mud and wet. They were the symbols of his regeneration. Since then he had brought other burdens to camp and had thrown them at her feet. For what? Later on, in a moist spot, he stopped and peered at the ground curiously. Other footprints had emerged from somewhere and joined his own, fresh footprints, one made by the inturned toe of an Indian, the other smaller, the heel of which cut deep into the mud and moss. He bent forward, following them eagerly. What could a woman be doing here? Suddenly Gallatin straightened and sniffed the air. The smoke of a campfire, the smell of cooking fish. Someone had preceded him. He moved forward cautiously, his heart beating with suppressed excitement, his mind for the first time aware that unusual impulses had dominated him all the morning. He also knew that the smell of those cooking fish was delicious. In a moment he recognized the glade, the two beech trees and the rock, saw the bulk of the shack that he had built, the glow of the fire, and a small figure sitting on a log before it, cooking fish on a spit. He stopped and passed a hand before his eyes. Had a year passed, or was it yesterday? Who was the girl that sat familiarly at his fire, hatless, her brown hair tawny in the sunlight, her slender neck bent forward? He rubbed his eyes and peered again. There was no mistake. It was Jane. End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of The Silent Battle by George Gibbs. Recording by Tony Oliva. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Arcadia again. She did not move at his approach, although his footsteps among the dried leaves must have been plainly audible, and he was within 10 feet of the fire before she turned. "We had better be going soon, Challón," she began, and then stopped as she raised her head and looked at him. He wore his old fishing hat with the holes in it, a faded blue flannel shirt, corduroys and laced boots, and as her eye passed quickly over his figure to his face, she paled, started backward, and stared with a terror in her eyes of something beyond comprehension. He saw her put her arm before her face to shut out the sight of him, and rise to one knee, stumbling blindly away, when he caught her in his arms, whispering madly, "Jane, Jane, don't turn away from me. It's Phil. Do you hear? Myself, no other. You were waiting for me, and I came to you." She trembled violently, and her hand clutched his arm as though to assure herself of its reality. "Jane, look up at me. Look in my eyes, and you'll see your vision there, where it has always been and always will be. Unchangeable. Look at me, Jane." Slowly she raised her head and saw that what he said was true, the pallor of dismay retreating before the warm flush that suffused her from neck to brow. "It's you, Phil? I can't understand." "Nor I. I don't know or care, so long as you are here, close in my arms. I'll never let you go again. Kiss me, Jane." She obeyed blindly, passionately, the wonder in her eyes dying in heavenly content. "You came to me, Phil?" she whispered. "How? Why?" "Because you wanted me. Because you were waiting for me. Isn't it so?" "Yes, I was waiting for you. I came here because I couldn't stay away. I don't know why I came." She paused and her hands tightened on his shoulders again. "Oh, Phil," she cried again. "There's no mistake?" "No, no." "You frightened me so. I thought you were unreal, a vision. Your hat, your clothes are the same. I thought you were the ghost of happiness." He kissed her tenderly. "There are no ghosts, Jane dear, not even those of unhappiness," he murmured. "There is no room for anything in the world but hope and joy and love, yours and mine. I love you, dearest. Even when reason despaired, I loved you most and loved the pain of it." "The pain of it. I know." She was sobbing now, her slender body quivering under his caress. "Don't, Jane," he whispered. "Don't cry. Don't." But she smiled up at him through her tears. "Let me, Phil. I'm so happy." He soothed her gently and held her close in his arms, her head against his breast, as he would have held that of a tired child. After a time she relaxed and lay quiet. "You're glad?" he asked. There was no reply. "Are you glad?" he repeated. "Glad? Oh, Phil, I've suffered so." "Oh, Jane, why? Look at me, dear. It was all a mistake. How could you have misjudged me?" She drew away from him and took his head between the palms of her hands and sought his eyes with her own. "There was no other?" she asked haltingly. "No, 1,000 times no." He returned her gaze eagerly. "How could there be any other?" he asked simply. She looked long and then closed her eyes and drew his lips down to hers. "You believe in me now?" he asked. "Yes," she whispered, her eyes still closed. "I believe in you. Even if I didn't, I would still adore you. God bless you for that." "But you do believe?" he persisted. Yes, I do believe in you, Phil. I can't doubt you when you look at me like that." "Then I'll never look away from you." "Don't look away. Those eyes, how they've haunted me. The shadows in them. There are no shadows now, Phil. They're laughing at me, at my feminine weakness, convinced against itself. I thought you were a ghost." She held him away and looked at him. "But you're not in the least ghost-like. You're looking very well. I don't believe you've worried." "Nor you. I've never seen you looking handsomer. It's hardly flattering to my vanity." she sighed. "I've lived in Arcadia for 3 weeks." He led her over to the log beside the shack and sat beside her. "Tell me," he said at last, "how you came to be here alone." She straightened quickly and peered around. "But I'm not alone. My guide, he went into the brush for firewood." "Curious." "He should be back by now."
"I hope he doesn't come back."
"Oh, Phil, so do I. But he will. And you?"
"My guide, Joe Keegón, is there."
And he pointed upstream. A shade passed over her face.
"But we'll send them away, Jane, back where they came from. We need no guides now, you and I, no guides but our hearts, no servants but our hands. We'll begin again where we left off. Yesterday."
She crouched closer in his arms. "Yesterday. Yes, it was only yesterday that we were here," she sighed. "But the long night between."
"A dream, Jane, a dream, a phantom unhappiness. Only this is real."
"Are you sure? I'm afraid I'll awaken."
"No," he laughed. "See, the fire is just as we left it last night. The black log charred, the shack, your bed, the 2 birch trees and your ridgepole."
"Yes," she smiled.
"The 2 creels and the cooking fish."
"Oh, those fish! My fish are all in the fire."
"Do you care?"
"No. I'll let them burn. But you'll be good to me, won't you, Phil?" There was another long pause. About them the orchestral stillness of the deep woods, amid which they lived a moment of immortality, all thought, all speech inadequate to their sweet communion. A venturesome sparrow perched itself upon Jane's ridgepole, and after putting its head on one side in inquiry, uttered a low and joyful chirp, and failing to attract attention, flew away to tell the gossip to its mate. The breeze crooned, the stream sighed, and the sunlight kissed the cardinal flowers which lifted their heads for its caress. All nature breathed contentment, peace and consummation. But there was much to be said, much mystery to be revealed, and it was Jane who first spoke. She drew away from him gently and looked out into the underbrush. "Phil, those guides," she whispered. "They may have seen."
"Let them. I don't care. Do you?"
"Yes. Let me think. I can't understand. Why hasn't Challón come back? He was here a minute ago. Or was it an hour? I don't know." Her fingers struggled with the disorder of her hair as she smiled at him.
"Challón is a myth. I don't believe you had a guide."
"A myth indeed. I wish he was now. I wanted to go out alone, but father wouldn't let me."
"Mr. Loring."
Gallatin started up.
"Oh, of course," he sighed. "I had forgotten that there were such things as fathers."
"But there is," she laughed. "A perfectly substantial father within 10 miles from here."
"You're in camp again, in the same spot?"
She nodded.
"Anyone else?" he frowned. "Not Mr. Van Duyn?"
"Oh, dear, no. Coley has gone to Carlsbad." He took her by the hand again.
"You sent him away?"
"Yes."
"When?"
"After Clovelly. Oh, Phil, you hurt me so. But I couldn't stand seeing him after that."
"Why?"
"Because, cruel as you were, I knew that you were right and that I was wrong. I hated you that night, hated you because you made me such a pitiful thing. But, oh, I loved you too, more than ever. If only you hadn't been so hard, so bitter. If you had been gentle then, you might have taken me in your arms and crushed me if you liked. I shouldn't have cared."
"Shh. That was only in the dream, Jane." And then, "You never cared for him?" he asked quickly.
"Never."
"Then why?"
"My pride, Phil."
"Poor Coley." He echoed the words heartlessly. "Poor Coley." A pause. "Who else is in camp?"
"Colonel Broadhurst, Mr. Worthington, Mr. and Mrs. Pennington."
"Nellie here?"
"Yes." She had never been in the woods before. "Why, what is the matter, Phil?" Gallatin straightened, one hand to his forehead.
"I have it," he said.
"Have what?"
"It was Nellie. I might have guessed it."
"Guessed?"
"It was her plan, coming up here to the woods. Before we left New York, she and John Kenyon were as thick as thieves, and oh, good old Uncle John, he did it. I remember now 100 things."
It was Jane's turn to be surprised.
"Yes,
"Yes, it's true, Phil. Oh, how cleverly they managed. But how could Nellie have known that I would come here? I only told Johnny Chalone."
Phil laughed. "Nellie Pennington is a remarkable woman. She knew. She knows everything."
"Yes, I think she does," said Jane. "We've been in camp a week. I started with Chalone 4 days ago. He said he had lost the trail and I gave it up. This morning I can see it all now. Father and Nellie started me off themselves at sunrise. They knew I'd come here and—" She stopped and took him abruptly by the arm. "Phil, those wicked people had even fixed the day and hour of our meeting." He nodded.
"Of course. I wanted to come yesterday, but they wouldn't let me. If I had, I should have missed you."
"Oh, how terrible." Her accents were so genuine, her face so distressed at this possibility, that he laughed and caught her in his arms again.
"But I didn't miss you, Jane. That's the point. Even if I had, Nellie would have managed somehow. She's an extraordinary woman."
"She is, Phil. She chaperoned me until Coley was at the point of exasperation."
"Quite right of her, too."
"But why has she taken such an interest in you, in us?"
"Because she's an angel. Because she has the wisdom of the centuries. Because she is a born matchmaker. Because she always does what she makes up her mind to do. And lastly, and most important, Jane, she has a proper sense of the eternal fitness of things."
"That's true. Nothing else was possible, was it, Phil?"
"No, it was written 1,000 years ago."
She turned in his arms. "Have you thought that always?" she asked.
"I never gave up hoping."
"Nor I." She was silent a moment. "Phil."
"What, Jane?"
"Would you have come here to Arcadia alone, even if—"
"Yes, I would have come here alone. I was planning it all spring. This place is redolent of you. Your spirit has haunted it for a year. I wanted to be here to share it with Kee Way Din if I couldn't have yourself."
"What would you have done if I had not been here?"
"I don't know. Waited for you, I think."
"But it was I who waited."
"You didn't wait long. What were you thinking of there by the fire?"
"Of my dream."
"You dreamed of me?"
"Yes. The night we came into camp I dreamed of you. I saw you poling a canoe upstream. I followed you across a portage. There was a heavy pack upon your back, but you did not mind the weight, for your step was light and your face happy. There was a shadow in your eyes, the same shadow, but your lips were smiling. Night fell and still you toiled in the moonlight, and I knew that you were coming here. There were voices, too, and you were singing with them. But I wasn't afraid because you seemed so joyful."
I was joyful.
"I saw the shack and the ashes of the fire, and I saw you coming through the bushes toward it. But when you came to the fire, I was not there. You called me, but I couldn't answer. I tried to, but I seemed to be dumb. And that was all.
A dream.
It was all true, except the last. That's why I came. I wanted to be here so that if you did come, you might not be disappointed. I had failed you before. I did not want it to happen again. I brought Shalom to show me the way. I was coming here again and again until you found me." He raised her chin and looked into her eyes.
"Dream again, dear."
"I'm dreaming now," she sighed. "It is so sweet. Don't let me wake, Phil. It mightn't be true."
"Yes, it's true, all true. You'll marry me, Jane?"
"Whenever you ask me to." He looked away from her, down the stream where the sunlight danced in the open.
"I told you once that I would come for you some day when I had conquered myself," he said slowly. "When I had made a place among the useful men of the world, when I could look my enemy in the eye for a long while and not be defeated, to stare him down until he stole away far off where I wouldn't ever find him."
"Yes, he has gone, Jane.
He does not trouble me and will not. I know. It was a long battle, a silent battle between us, but I've won and I'm ready to take you, Jane."
"Take me then." Her lips were already his. "You could have had me before, Phil," she murmured. "I would have fought the enemy with you. He was my enemy, too. But you would not have me." He shook his head.
"Not then. It was my own fight, not yours. And yet if it hadn't been for you, perhaps I shouldn't have fought at all."
She drew away from him a little. "No, I didn't help you. I only made it harder. I'll regret that always. It was your own victory against odds." He smiled.
"What does it matter now? I had to win. Not that battle alone, but others."
"Yes, I know," she smiled. "Father is mad about you." Gallatin threw up his chin and laughed to the sky.
"He ought to be. I'd be mad, too, in his place."
His joy was infectious, and she smiled at him fondly. "You're a very wonderful person, aren't you?"
"How could a demigod be anything else but wonderful? You created me. Aren't you pleased with your handiwork?"
"Immensely." He paused a moment and then whispered into her ear.
"You'll marry me soon?"
"Yes."
"When?"
"Whenever you want me, Phil."
"This summer. They shall leave us here," he said.
She colored divinely.
"Oh, it can be managed."
"A wedding in the woods? Oh, Phil."
"Why not? I'll see."
But she put her fingers over his lips and would not listen to him.
"Yes, dear,"
he insisted, capturing her hands.
"It shall be here. All this is ours, our forest, our stream, our sunlight, yours and mine, our kingdom. Would you change a kingdom for a villa or a fashionable hotel?"
"No, no," she whispered.
"We will begin life together here, where love began, alone. You shall cook and I shall kill for you, and build with my own hands another shack, a larger one with 2 windows and a door, a wonderful shack with chairs, a table,
And a porcelain bathtub?"
"No, the bath is down the corridor to the right."
She had used it. "It will do," she smiled. "May I have a mirror?"
"The pool."
Her lips twisted. "I tried it once and fell in. A mirror, please," she insisted.
"Yes, a mirror then."
"And a very tiny steamer trunk?" He laughed.
"Oh, yes, and a French maid, smelling salts, and a motor."
"Phil, what shall I cook with?"
"A frying pan and a tin coffee pot."
"But I can make such beautiful muffins."
"I'll build an oven."
"And cake."
"We'll live like gods."
"Demigods."
"And goddesses."
It was sweet nonsense, but nobody heard it but themselves. The shadows lengthened, the patches of light turned to gold, were lifting along the tree trunks, when from the deeps of the ancient forest below them there came three flute-like notes of liquid music of such depth and richness that they sat spellbound. In a moment they heard it again, the three cadenced notes of unearthly beauty, and then the pause, where all nature held its breath and waited to hear again.
"The hermit thrush,"
he whispered. "Oh, Phil, it's from the very soul of things." "Sh." But they did not hear it again. The hermit thrush sings seldom, and then only to those who belong to the immortal brotherhood of the forest. End of chapter 29. The end of The Silent Battle by George Gibbs.